Blanche Bastable, the daughter who shot her mother. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. There are some crimes so violent, so unnatural, that they seem to rupture not only a household, but the order of the world itself. In Victorian England, few acts were regarded with greater horror than the destruction of the family from within. The home was held up as sacred. The mother was imagined as its moral center. The daughter was expected to be dutiful, modest, pious, and obedient. When that order failed, the shock was immense. When a daughter raised her hand against her mother, it was almost beyond comprehension. And yet, in the quiet Dorset village of East Orchard, that unthinkable thing came to pass. This book tells the story of Blanche Bastable, a farmer's daughter whose name has largely faded from popular memory, though the crime attached to it has lost none of its power to disturb. In an age obsessed with respectability, religion, discipline, and female virtue, Blanche's case exposed the fragility of every comforting assumption Victorian society wished to make about women, madness, and domestic life. She was not a stranger in a dark alley, nor a hardened criminal of the city slums, nor a theatrical poisoner of sensation fiction. She was a daughter. She belonged to the hearth. And it was from within that intimate sphere that violence emerged. But this is not only a story of murder. It is also a story of breakdown, of fear, of a family trying and failing to contain something they did not understand. It is a story of how Victorian England interpreted troubled women, with pity, suspicion, moral judgment, medical language, and, very often, confinement. Blanche Bastable's path led not only through scandal and bloodshed, but into the shadowed world of Broadmoor, where those considered both criminal and insane were removed from ordinary society and placed beyond its boundaries. In that movement from village daughter to criminal lunatic, her case becomes something larger than a single act of violence. It becomes a lens through which to examine an entire culture. The Victorian world was quick to divide women into neat categories: angel, wife, mother, spinster, fallen woman, lunatic. Real lives did not fit so comfortably. Blanche did not fit. Whether she was wicked, ill, tormented, dangerous, failed by those around her, or some tragic combination of all these things is not a question that can be answered easily, nor should it be. The dead deserve honesty, the living deserve complexity, and the past, however dark, deserves more than simplification. That is especially true in a case such as this, where the temptation toward sensation is strong. The bare outline alone is enough to invite lurid retelling: a young woman, a gun, a mother slain, a village horrified. But the purpose of this book is not to revel in shock. It is to look steadily at what happened and to ask what kind of world produced it, recorded it, judged it, and then, in time, almost forgot it. True crime, when written well, does more than recount atrocity. It restores context. It restores people. It restores the uneasy humanity that sensational versions so often erase. At the center of this story stands not only Blanche, but Elizabeth Bastable, the mother whose life was violently cut short. Too often in historical crime writing, the murdered woman is eclipsed by the notoriety of the person who killed her. Here, she must remain visible. A crime within the family is never a solitary act in its consequences. It tears through relationships, through memory, through community. The death of a mother in a rural Victorian household was not merely a private sorrow. It was a communal wound, and one that would have echoed far beyond the walls of the Bastable home. This book has been written with that awareness in mind. It seeks neither to excuse nor to condemn too neatly. Rather, it attempts to reconstruct a life, a death, and the world around them with care, restraint, and seriousness. Where the historical record is thin, I have resisted invention. Where Victorian language reflects attitudes now outdated or cruel, I have preserved the meaning while remaining mindful of the harm such categories once did. And where the silence of the archives remains, I have allowed silence to stand, rather than forcing certainty where none exists. Blanche Bastable's story is haunting precisely because it resists comfortable resolution. It sits at the intersection of crime and illness, family duty and terror, pity and revulsion. It reminds us that behind every sensational headline of the past there were rooms, voices, routines, griefs, and private struggles now mostly lost to time. To revisit such a case is to step into those shadows, not to exploit them, but to understand them. In the chapters that follow, we return to rural Dorset, to a village shaped by custom and closeness, to a family under strain, and to a young woman whose collapse would end in irreversible violence. From there, the story widens outward, into the courtroom, the press, the asylum, and the larger Victorian imagination that both feared and pathologized women who could not be contained. Some crimes are remembered because they are famous. Others endure because they disturb something deeper. This is one of those stories. Introduction. In the Victorian imagination, the home was supposed to be the safest and most orderly place in the world. It was where authority was meant to rest gently but firmly, where family life was governed by duty, religion, work, and habit, and where women, particularly wives and mothers, were expected to provide moral steadiness. The ideal was repeated so often, and with such confidence, that it came to seem natural. The household stood as a small kingdom of its own, disciplined, respectable, private. Beneath its roof, daughters were to be obedient, useful, modest, and self-controlled. Mothers were to guide, soothe, manage, and endure. Whatever tensions existed within that structure were expected to remain contained. When violence entered such a setting, the shock was profound. The murder of a mother by her daughter was not merely a crime in the ordinary sense. It was an offense against feeling, against hierarchy, against custom, and against one of the most deeply protected ideas of 19th century domestic life. In cases of this kind, the act itself was often treated as almost beyond language. A robbery, a drunken assault, a killing in the street. These could be absorbed into familiar categories of criminal behavior. But a daughter turning a weapon upon her mother seemed to break something more intimate and more sacred. It suggested that the household, rather than defending civilization from disorder, might itself conceal fear, distress, instability, and violence. Such crimes were rare enough to be memorable and troubling enough to linger. The case of Blanche Bastable, a farmer's daughter from East Orchard in Dorset, belongs to that disturbing category of domestic crime which unsettled Victorian England not only because of what was done, but because of who did it and where. This was not the world of notorious urban vice, nor the sensational city underworld so beloved by newspaper readers. It was a rural parish, a farming household, a mother and daughter. The setting gave the case an added force. Violence in the countryside was often imagined as older, quieter, and less visible than the crimes of the city, but it was no less real. In villages and hamlets, the closeness of community could intensify tragedy rather than soften it. Every household was known. Every family history was partially public. Reputation mattered. Behavior was watched. Disturbance was noticed, discussed, and remembered. Within such a setting, a family's private strain rarely remained private for long. Blanche Bastable's story survives only in fragments. Like many 19th century women whose lives entered the historical record through crisis rather than achievement, she appears most clearly at the moment when her life had already begun to unravel. The details that endure are uneven and shaped by the priorities of those who recorded them: officials, doctors, journalists, clerks, and later commentators. The language used around her was the language of the time, and it was seldom neutral. Disturbance in a woman might be described as mania, derangement, hysteria, religious excitement, instability, or moral failure, sometimes all at once. The categories overlapped. Illness and sin were not always cleanly separated, nor were fear and judgment. To become legible to Victorian institutions, a woman often had to be translated into terms that revealed as much about the society observing her as they did about the woman herself. That problem lies at the heart of this book. Any attempt to tell Blanche Bastable's story must reckon with the nature of the surviving record. Partial, formal, sometimes contradictory, and often shaped by systems more concerned with classification than understanding. The Victorian archive does not speak in one voice. It murmurs through court reports, legal registers, parish traces, medical opinion, family record, and newspaper summary. It notes conduct, symptoms, outcomes, and dates. It is far less reliable when it comes to interior life. The emotional texture of a household under strain, the small fears, the exhausted attempts at management, the moments of denial, the flickers of hope, the private dread, rarely survives intact. Yet those missing textures matter, because domestic crime is never fully explained by the final violent act alone. It grows in rooms long before it enters the public record. The temptation in such a case is to reach immediately for sensation. The outline appears to invite it. A young woman, a gun, a mother dead, a rural village shocked, an asylum beyond the ordinary world. The elements seem arranged almost too neatly for dramatic treatment. But the neater a crime appears in summary, the more likely it is that what truly mattered has been compressed or lost. The aim here is not to heighten the strange features of the case for effect, nor to smooth its uncertainties into a tidy narrative. It is to remain close to what can be known, attentive to what cannot, and honest about the distance between event and record. That distance is especially important in a case involving mental disturbance. Victorian England possessed an increasingly elaborate language for insanity, but that language did not necessarily produce clarity. By the second half of the 19th century, medicine, law, religion, and popular morality all competed to define abnormal behavior. When a woman became erratic, fixated, violent, withdrawn, or emotionally extreme, her condition might be interpreted according to whichever framework seemed most convenient or most authoritative at the time. She might be pitted as unwell, feared as dangerous, dismissed as willful, or condemned as morally fallen. She might be described in one setting as suffering and in another as culpable. Her own experience, where recoverable at all, was filtered through institutions that did not primarily exist to preserve her perspective. For women, this could be particularly severe. The Victorian daughter was expected to inhabit a narrow emotional and social range. She was to be dutiful without being assertive, devout without enthusiasm that tipped into excess, useful without complaint, and modest in both speech and bearing. Any serious departure from those expectations could quickly become legible as disorder. This does not mean that all women who troubled their families were simply misunderstood, nor that mental illness was always misread when identified. It means, rather, that female distress was interpreted within a culture that already carried strong assumptions about what a proper woman should be. Those assumptions shaped the response long before any doctor, magistrate, or journalist entered the picture. Blanche Bastable's life unfolded within that framework. She was born into a rural world governed by labor and routine. Agricultural households were places of constant work, economic vulnerability, and close dependence. Family members lived not only together, but through one another's usefulness. A daughter in such a household was part of the domestic and practical machinery of life. She was expected to contribute, to fit, to remain within the rhythms of the family economy. When harmony failed, there were few buffers. Space was limited, privacy was limited, medical intervention was inconsistent and often late. The burden of managing distress usually fell first upon the family itself. Long before a troubled woman entered an asylum or a courtroom, she had often already been negotiated, contained, feared, and discussed within the home. That is part of what gives this case its force. The story of Blanche Bastable is not only the story of a single act of violence. It is also the story of what preceded it and what followed it. The difficulty of recognizing serious mental collapse, the vulnerability of women inside structures built to contain them, the social embarrassment and fear attached to behavioral disturbance, the movement from domestic unease to public scandal, and the machinery by which Victorian England removed certain women from ordinary life altogether. Once Blanche entered the orbit of the law and the asylum system, her identity changed. She ceased to be merely a daughter in difficulty and became something more formal and more permanent in the eyes of the state. A woman whose violence and mental condition placed her outside the boundaries of manageable domestic life. In that sense, her story reaches beyond Dorset. It opens onto the broader 19th century history of criminal lunacy, institutional confinement, and the uneasy borderland between punishment and treatment. It also belongs to the history of women whose lives were documented only when they had gone disastrously wrong. Men who committed violence were often understood through the language of aggression, vice, drunkenness, or criminal habit. Women who committed violence, especially against those within the family, often provoked a more unsettled response. Their actions appeared to challenge both law and nature. They were often read not only as dangerous, but as aberrant, women who had departed from femininity itself. That idea deserves scrutiny. No person becomes less human by becoming difficult to classify. If anything, the cases that resist simple explanation demand greater care. Blanche Bastable is not best understood as a curiosity or a grotesque example of female violence, nor is she best reduced to a passive emblem of Victorian misunderstanding. The record suggests disturbance, but disturbance does not erase responsibility. Equally, responsibility does not erase suffering. Between these truths lies the harder task of historical writing, to avoid sentimental absolution and crude condemnation alike. The past is not served well by either, nor is the dead. At the center of this story stands not only Blanche, but Elizabeth Bastable, the mother whose death made the case visible to history. In family murder, the victim is especially vulnerable to disappearance. Public attention settles naturally upon the killer, particularly where the killer is young, female, or judged insane. The murdered woman can become little more than a role. The mother, the deceased, the body from which the case proceeds. Yet she, too, belonged to a household, a marriage, a routine, a set of relationships and obligations. Her death was not only an element of a shocking narrative, it was the violent ending of a real and ordinary life. Any account that loses sight of that life risks becoming unbalanced from the outset. This book does not seek to solve every uncertainty surrounding the case. Some questions cannot now be answered with confidence. The surviving evidence does not allow full access to motive, to daily conversation within the Bastable household, or to the precise shape of Blanche's thoughts as her condition worsened. It does, however, allow the outlines of a tragedy to emerge. Those outlines are enough to show that this was not an isolated moment detached from context. It was the culmination of pressures, personal, familial, social, and institutional, that can still be examined, even where they cannot be fully recovered. The chapters that follow move from the local world of East Orchard into the larger structures that absorbed and interpreted the crime. They begin with place, the agricultural parish, the family, the routines of rural life, and the conditions that shaped women's existence within such communities. They then turn to Blanche herself, as far as the record permits, tracing the signs of distress that preceded the killing and the responses such behavior elicited. From there, the narrative enters the fatal event, its immediate aftermath, and the legal and medical processes that transformed a village tragedy into a matter for the state. Finally, the story widens again, situating Blanche Bastable within the broader Victorian history of domestic violence, female mental illness, and confinement. The purpose is not to force the case into modern certainty. It is to place it where it belongs, within the textures of its own time, and within the enduring human questions it still raises. How does a family recognize danger when danger wears a familiar face? What becomes of care when care turns to fear? What happens when a woman can no longer remain within the emotional boundaries her world has assigned to her? At what point does distress become thread in the eyes of others? And once violence has occurred, who is remembered as a person, and who is reduced to a category? These questions cannot restore what was lost in East Orchard. They cannot repair the silences left by death, nor can they undo the failures of a system that often answered confusion with confinement. But they do make it possible to read the case as more than an isolated horror. They allow it to be seen as part of a wider history in which family life, mental disturbance, and institutional power met in ways that were often devastating, especially for women. Blanche Bastable's story begins in a village that seemed, on the surface, orderly and still. It ends in a place created to contain those whom ordinary society could neither understand nor tolerate. Between those two worlds lies the history of a crime that was once shocking enough to be spoken of with horror, and ordinary enough, in its domestic setting, to reveal something far darker about Victorian life than sensational retellings usually admit. Chapter 1. The Village at the Edge of Silence. East Orchard was not the sort of place from which great crimes were expected to emerge. It stood in the Dorset countryside with the quiet authority of an old parish, shaped by fields, hedgerows, lanes, and the repeated habits of agricultural life. It was small enough for households to be known to one another, small enough for absence to be noticed, and small enough for any disruption to travel quickly without ever seeming to move at all. In such places, news did not always spread by open declaration. It passed instead through glances, pauses, altered tones of voice, remarks made at gates, at church paths, in shop doorways, and in the moments after ordinary inquiries had ostensibly ended. A community could remain outwardly composed while circulating, with considerable efficiency, every detail it believed worth keeping. The landscape itself contributed to that impression of order. Rural parishes in 19th century Dorset often appeared stable from a distance. The fields continued in their seasons. Labor followed its calendar. Cattle were tended, milked, bought, sold, and counted. Gardens yielded what they could. Bread was baked. Fires were lit. Water was fetched. Church bells marked the hours with the same impartiality, whether a household was flourishing or in distress. To look at such a place from the road, or to pass through it only briefly, was to encounter a kind of stillness that could easily be mistaken for peace. But stillness and peace were not the same thing. Behind the doors of even the most unremarkable homes there existed the usual human burdens: money worries, illness, disappointment, resentment, fatigue, private grief, tempers held in check, and tempers not held in check at all. The countryside did not prevent such things. It only altered their appearance. In towns and cities, strain might be made visible by crowding, public disorder, noise, and the wear of relentless movement. In villages, strain was more often absorbed into routine. A household in difficulty might continue to appear orderly long after it had ceased to feel secure. Work had to be done whether spirits were low or not. Animals needed tending whether anyone had slept well or not. Meals had to be prepared. Clothes had to be mended. Children, if there were children, had to be washed, watched, and fed. The practical duties of life gave little allowance for emotional crisis, and less for those whose distress could not be neatly set aside. East Orchard belonged to that world of practical endurance. It was not a place of social anonymity. Identity in such a parish was not formed primarily by private self-description, but by family, occupation, conduct, religion, and local memory. A person was known as someone's wife, daughter, son, laborer, farmer, servant, or widow. Reputation was not ornamental. It had use. It shaped who might be trusted, who might be helped, who might be watched, and whose difficulties would be understood as temporary misfortune rather than evidence of deeper defect. Families, no less than individuals, lived under this form of scrutiny. A respectable household was expected to govern itself. It was expected to keep order without drawing official attention, and to absorb trouble without public collapse. Where those expectations failed, pity could quickly turn to discomfort, and discomfort to judgment. The Bastables were one such family, rooted in the agricultural life of the district. They were not aristocratic, nor urban, nor part of the criminal fringe that Victorian journalism often liked to display for moral instruction or entertainment. Their life belonged to the more common and less theatrically recorded world of rural labor and domestic responsibility. This in itself is important. Crimes that later appear dramatic in summary often begin in households that, for years beforehand, would have seemed entirely ordinary to those around them. Their tragedy lies partly in that ordinariness. There is no obvious threshold at which a family becomes the sort of family about whom a case history will one day be written. Most simply continue under pressure until continuation is no longer possible. For a farming household in rural Dorset, daily life was structured by labor before it was shaped by feeling. Whatever affection or tension existed within the family had to coexist with necessity. The day began early. There were animals to manage, dairying tasks to complete, food to prepare, clothing to wash, household spaces to maintain, and countless small acts of organization that made the difference between a functioning home and a failing one. Such labor was not evenly distributed. Men and women often worked alongside one another in interdependent but distinct roles, and daughters, particularly in modest rural households, were expected to contribute as naturally as breathing. Usefulness was one of the first virtues demanded of them. To be a daughter in such a world was to grow up under a discipline so ordinary it could pass almost unnoticed. A young woman was expected to be steady in conduct, modest in manner, restrained in speech, and willing in work. She was to assist rather than resist, to observe rather than dominate, and to become in time either a competent wife or a dutiful unmarried daughter whose labor remained at the disposal of the household. Her inner life, unless it took on a form that could be publicly admired as piety or patience, did not attract much social interest. Emotional intensity was tolerated only within narrow limits. Too much animation, too much opinion, too much gloom, too much visible agitation, too much spiritual fervor, too much withdrawal, any of these might begin to draw notice. Rural communities were often close observers of behavior, even when they lacked a vocabulary more subtle than troublesome, peculiar, unsettled, or not right. For women, especially, the boundary between unconventional feeling and suspected disorder could be very thin. This is the world into which Blanche Bastable belonged. Before her name became attached to one of the most disturbing forms of domestic violence imaginable, she would have been seen first through the usual village categories: a farmer's daughter, a young woman of the parish, a member of a known family. That prior identity matters because it reminds us that she did not begin at the edge of society. She began inside its ordinary structures. Whatever later happened did not descend from nowhere. It developed in a setting governed by work, familiarity, expectation, and observation. The temptation, when approaching a case such as this, is to move too quickly towards the event that made it memorable. The mind reaches instinctively for the crime. It wants the weapon, the moment, the explanation, the legal outcome, the point at which history declares itself. But in domestic cases, especially those involving family members, the crime alone rarely explains the full shape of the tragedy. Long before violence becomes public, the atmosphere of a household may already have changed. What outsiders later describe as sudden often proves, upon closer examination, to have been preceded by unease, by repeated incidents, by conversations whose contents are lost but whose consequences remain, and by the slow erosion of confidence within the home. A village such as East Orchard would have been capable of noticing such erosion without necessarily understanding it. A change in a daughter's behavior might first appear as temperament, then as strain, then as a trial to the family, then as a source of embarrassment, then, perhaps, as something more serious and less manageable. But households were rarely eager to have such transitions named too early. Naming carried consequences. To say that someone was unwell in mind was not simply to describe them. It was to place them in relation to fear, shame, and authority. It raised questions about supervision, about moral responsibility, about what neighbors might say, and about whether officials or doctors might need to be involved. Families often delayed such acknowledgments until delay was no longer sustainable. That reluctance was not necessarily cruelty. Often it was simply the ordinary human wish to believe that difficulty would pass. In a small rural parish, where privacy was limited and resources limited further still, there were strong incentives to manage trouble internally for as long as possible. The family was expected to be the first and strongest container of distress. If a daughter became emotionally volatile, withdrawn, irrational, fixated, or frightening, those around her might still try to interpret her through familiar and less alarming ideas: nerves, weakness, stubbornness, grief, disappointment, religious excitement, female difficulty, bad temper, oversensitivity. Such phrases were not precise diagnoses. They were social coverings, ways of speaking around what could not yet be faced directly. What could not be easily covered, however, was fear. Fear altered the atmosphere of a household before it altered its outward form. It changed the manner in which rooms were entered, conversations started, objects put away, and silences observed. It made ordinary domestic life effortful. A mother already burdened by work might find herself taking on additional emotional vigilance. A father might become sterner, more withdrawn, or more helpless than he wished to appear. Other family members might learn to watch, to avoid, to placate, or to leave certain matters untouched. These adjustments seldom entered official records, yet they were often the very substance of life before a crisis. The Victorian home, so frequently idealized in moral language, was also the place where unresolved distress had the least room in which to move. This contradiction lay at the heart of many 19th century domestic tragedies. The home was praised as a refuge, but for those whose minds were troubled it could become an enclosure. The daughter, who could not regulate herself according to expectation, did not simply fail in a private sense. She disrupted an entire model of order. Her conduct placed pressure on the mother tasked with preserving calm, on the father expected to maintain authority, and on the families standing in the community. It is therefore not surprising that cases involving female disturbance were often remembered with a peculiar mixture of alarm and fascination. They threatened not only bodily safety, but the cultural fiction that home naturally produced stability. A farming family felt this pressure in practical as well as moral terms. Agricultural life depended upon repetition and reliability. There was limited tolerance for unpredictability where labor was concerned. A daughter who could no longer be counted upon, or whose presence unsettled the rest of the household, was not simply a sorrow. She might become a disruption to the functioning of the home itself. This did not strip the situation of tenderness or loyalty, but it complicated both. Families could love deeply and still feel exhausted. They could protect and resent in the same breath. They could recognize suffering and still dread its effects. Such contradictions are not aberrations of domestic life. They are often its most painful truths. Nothing about East Orchard exempted it from those truths. If anything, the close texture of village life made them sharper. In a larger place, distress might disperse into anonymity for a time. In a small parish, it remained near. The same lanes were walked, the same church attended, the same neighbors encountered. Whatever was amiss had no distance in which to dissolve. It pressed against the routine of every week. And because everyone was known in relation to everyone else, one person's instability could easily become another family's conversation, another household's cautionary lesson, another cluster of whispers after service on a Sunday. Yet the village should not be imagined as uniformly cold. Communities could be watchful and compassionate at once. They could offer help, practical advice, or quiet sympathy. But sympathy in the 19th century often had limits defined by endurance and respectability. Trouble was bearable so long as it remained intelligible. Once it crossed into the alarming or socially disruptive, communal warmth could recede. Concern gave way to distance. People began to speak not of hardship, but of danger. That threshold is difficult to trace in any historical case, and Blanche Bastable's is no exception. The record does not preserve every stage by which concern hardened into alarm. It does not hand down the tone of voice in which her name was first spoken differently, or the first moment at which a member of the family ceased to feel merely burdened and began to feel unsafe. Such transitions were often registered not in formal language, but in the altered habits of daily life. A mother who no longer trusted a room to remain calm. A household that became reluctant to leave one person unattended. Objects moved. Conversations shortened. Doors listened through. The signs of distress accumulated in practice long before they appeared in evidence. What the later case makes clear is that the Bastable household did not move directly from ordinary life into catastrophe. There was a period, perhaps extended, perhaps broken by false improvements, in which strain deepened and the family lived with something increasingly difficult to master. Such periods often leave only faint traces in the archive because they belong to the private history of inconvenience, dread, endurance, and denial. Yet they are the real beginning of many crimes. By the time the public sees the violence, those within the house have often already been living in its shadow. To understand the significance of what happened in East Orchard, it is therefore necessary to understand the social and moral setting in which it occurred. Victorian England attached immense symbolic value to motherhood. The mother was imagined not merely as a parent, but as a moral presence around whom domestic order cohered. The daughter, in turn, was expected to move towards womanhood under maternal influence, learning obedience, discipline, and useful femininity within the home. The relationship was idealized to such an extent that its failures could scarcely be spoken of without discomfort. Ordinary conflict between mothers and daughters certainly existed, as it always has, but public culture preferred to represent the relationship as naturally affectionate, hierarchical, and secure. Where that bond fractured badly, the rupture seemed to threaten more than the individuals involved. It cast doubt upon the domestic ideal itself. The The killing of a mother by her daughter was thus never read as a simple interpersonal act. It carried moral shock beyond the immediate violence. It appeared to reverse the natural order of care and dependence. It disturbed assumptions about female softness and filial duty. It suggested that whatever forces had entered the household, illness, anger, fixation, terror, resentment, delusion, desperation, had overwhelmed the very structure supposed to prevent such things. For a rural parish, the effect would have been more acute still. The crime would not remain abstract. It would be mapped onto known faces, known rooms, known roads. The village would not merely hear of it. It would absorb it into memory. That memory, however, would not belong evenly to all involved. The killer, by the very extremity of the act, tends to dominate the historical imagination. The victim risks becoming a role rather than a person. Yet before she was the murdered mother in a tragic case, Elizabeth Bastable had been at the center of her own household life. Working, managing, sustaining, enduring. To think of the village only through the lens of Blanche's collapse would be to miss the structure of ordinary labor into which Elizabeth's life was woven. In rural homes, mothers were not ornamental moral guardians. They were workers. Their labor was constant, practical, and often physically demanding. The emotional authority later attributed to them by Victorian ideology sat alongside work that was repetitive, tiring, and very far from sentimental abstraction. If strain entered such a household, the mother was likely to bear a great deal of it first. She was close enough to the rhythms of domestic life to notice changes early, and exposed enough to a daughter's moods or behavior to feel their daily effect. A mother might attempt to soothe, conceal, correct, excuse, pray over, supervise, and defend in turn. She might become the person through whom the whole difficulty was managed until it could no longer be managed at all. In many families, this labor of emotional containment went unrecorded because it was treated as an extension of womanhood itself. Yet in cases that ended in violence, it is often one of the central, if least visible, features of the tragedy. East Orchard, then, was not merely the backdrop to the crime that would one day make Blanche Bastable historically legible. It was the environment that shaped the expectations under which the family lived and the pressures they were expected to withstand. Its silence was never absolute. It was the silence of contained things, of labor taken for granted, of distress not fully named, of reputations maintained by effort, and of communities that watched without always intervening. It was the silence that can exist in places where much is known and little is openly said. This is the silence at the edge of which the Bastable family lived. From outside, they would have appeared part of the normal fabric of village life. There was nothing in the bare social facts of the household to announce that it would one day be remembered in connection with one of the most intimate forms of violence. That, too, is part of what makes such cases unsettling. The household does not first present itself as extraordinary. It presents itself as recognizable. The lanes remain the same. The fields remain the same. The church remains standing. The ordinary tasks of morning and evening continue. Milk is carried. Fires are lit. Doors are opened and shut. Yet somewhere within that ordinary cycle, pressure accumulates. Something once containable ceases to be contained. A family begins, quietly, to move from strain into danger. The history of Blanche Bastable begins there, before the gun, before the legal language, before the asylum. It begins in a village that appeared still. It begins in a household that had not yet ceased to appear ordinary. And it begins in the long, uneasy interval during which silence holds, even as it starts to break. Chapter 2. Blanche before the crime. Before Blanche Bastable became the subject of legal record, village recollection, and later historical curiosity, she belonged to the ordinary obscurity in which most rural women of the 19th century lived and disappeared. Her name was not yet a case. It was not yet attached to violence, nor to the chilling category of the criminally insane. It belonged instead to the domestic world that had formed her. Family, parish, labor, and expectation. To understand the crime that would later eclipse everything else, it is necessary to begin there, in the quieter years when Blanche was still only a daughter in a Dorset household, known not for what she had done, but for where she belonged. This is often the most difficult part of a historical crime to reconstruct. The violent act tends to survive because institutions preserve it. Courts note it. Doctors interpret it. Newspapers condense it. Families, when they leave traces at all, are remembered through the disruption that brought them into official notice. What comes before is usually thinner. Fragments of census record, genealogical structure, the shape of an occupation, the geography of a parish, the assumptions of an era, and whatever passing references later accounts retain about a person's behavior before the event that made them visible. The result is that a figure such as Blanche Bastable comes into focus unevenly. The closer she stands to catastrophe, the more clearly the archive sees her. Before that point, she recedes again into the general life of women whose existence was important to their households and largely unimportant to the state. Even so, the outline matters. Blanche was born into a rural farming family in Dorset, a life that would have offered little in the way of privacy and less in the way of self-invention. Agricultural households did not encourage a sharp separation between personal identity and family function. To be born into such a family was to be drawn immediately into its pattern of need. Work was not an optional moral virtue, but part of the structure of belonging. Children grew up not at the edge of household life, but within it, absorbing from an early age the repeated lesson that usefulness was expected, endurance admired, and complaint of little value unless linked to visible bodily illness. For daughters, that lesson was especially persistent. A girl in rural Victorian England did not come into womanhood with the promise of broad independence. Her likely future was already implicit in the daily order of the home around her. She would work before she married, and if she married, she would continue to work. If she did not marry, she might remain attached to her family of origin, her labor still absorbed into the household economy. Her education, where available, did not necessarily alter that path. Religion might frame and dignify domestic duty, but it did not free her from it. The well-ordered daughter was expected to be modest, competent, composed, and self-regulating. Her emotions, unless expressed in the acceptable forms of piety, patience, or concern for others, were meant to remain disciplined. The inner life of such a woman was seldom asked after directly. This was not because feeling did not exist, but because the culture in which she lived did not easily center it. A daughter's restlessness, dissatisfaction, melancholy, or agitation might be noticed, but not necessarily interpreted as a matter deserving deep inquiry. Emotional disturbance in women had long been treated with a mixture of seriousness and trivialization. It could be seen, at one and the same time, as real and as somehow inherently female, and therefore less a crisis than an extension of sex temperament. A woman who wept too much, feared too much, prayed too intensely, withdrew too deeply, or spoke too urgently might be met with concern, impatience, moral advice, or practical supervision, depending on the tolerance of those around her and the social cost of her behavior. Only when distress became disruptive, frightening, or unmistakably public did it move beyond the domain of family endurance and enter the language of sickness or danger. There is reason to believe that Blanche's life moved gradually towards that threshold. Later accounts of the case suggest that before the shooting, she had shown signs of serious disturbance and had, at some stage, already come into contact with asylum care. Whether those around her understood the nature of her condition is another matter. The Victorian period possessed vocabulary for mental derangement, but such vocabulary did not guarantee either clarity or help. To say that a person was not right, deranged, unstable, or afflicted by mania was often to describe a problem without illuminating it. These terms might indicate acute mental illness, but they might also operate as broad moral and social labels for conduct that resisted easy management. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to being interpreted through these elastic categories. That vulnerability did not mean the suffering was unreal. On the contrary, it could mean that real suffering was repeatedly translated into language that reflected the assumptions and discomforts of others. If Blanche was indeed becoming unwell in mind before the crime, her experience would likely have been filtered first through her family's attempts to understand her, and those attempts would have been shaped by religion, habit, fear, local custom, and the limited explanatory models available in rural life. Such a process did not produce clean distinctions. Illness might look like obstinacy, delusion might be taken for dangerous excitement, Spiritual fixation might be praised briefly as seriousness and then condemned as excess. A daughter might seem at once pitiable and exasperating, afflicted and responsible, vulnerable and threatening. In most households, such contradictions were lived before they were ever spoken. The early life of Blanche Bastable would almost certainly have been made up of the usual tasks and repetitions of a farmer's daughter. The practical details mattered. They were the texture of existence. Mornings began early. Household labor was unending. There were clothes to wash and mend, floors to clean, food to prepare, utensils to tend, fires to keep, milk and dairy work to assist with, and the countless small routines without which no rural home could function properly. One of the peculiarities of domestic labor is that it is both constant and historically easy to overlook. A daughter could spend her entire youth in work essential to family survival and still leave only the faintest trace of it in the record. Yet such labor formed character and expectation alike. It trained the body into service, and it trained the mind into accommodation. To fail in steadiness was not merely a personal disappointment. It could become a visible difficulty for everyone else. In a close household, there was little room for emotional irregularity to remain private. If Blanche became withdrawn, agitated, erratic, unusually intense, or difficult to settle, those changes would have affected not only the atmosphere of the home, but its practical functioning. A daughter who could no longer reliably participate in ordinary duties placed additional burdens upon those around her, particularly upon the mother, who often carried responsibility both for domestic order and for the emotional containment of others. This is one reason why retrospective descriptions of disturbed women in the 19th century so often sound impatient as well as alarmed. The household was not a therapeutic institution. It was a place that required order. Whatever compassion a family felt, it had to coexist with exhaustion, fear, embarrassment, and the relentless fact of daily necessity. If Blanche's mental state was worsening, that worsening would not have unfolded in abstraction. It would have occurred in kitchens, yards, dairy spaces, sleeping rooms, meal times, and moments of unfinished work. It would have attached itself to ordinary tasks. A daughter who could not be left alone, who spoke in ways others found troubling, who became fixated on religious or emotional ideas, or who showed signs of volatility, would have altered the rhythm of the household long before any formal intervention. The later phrase attached to Blanche, religious mania, is revealing, not because it offers modern certainty, but because it exposes the kind of framework through which her behavior was interpreted. Victorian England was steeped in religious language and religious discipline, but it was not equally comfortable with religious intensity in every form. Devotion could be admired, especially in women, so long as it appeared orderly, humble, and socially legible. But when spiritual feeling crossed into obsession, agitation, prophecy, fixation, or moral extremity, the same culture that praised piety could quickly recast it as dangerous excess. This was particularly so when the person affected was a woman whose behavior no longer aligned with calm domestic virtue. Religious excitement might then be treated as evidence not of holiness, but of disturbed mind. If Blanche did indeed suffer a form of breakdown interpreted in those terms, the effect within the family may have been deeply destabilizing. Religion in a household could be a source of comfort, but it could also become a field upon which distress was fought over, misunderstood, or intensified. A daughter consumed by spiritual dread, certainty, fear, or compulsion might appear both suffering and alarming. Her speech could seem meaningful one day and incomprehensible the next. Her convictions might be interpreted by some as a sign of conscience, and by others as evidence that her mind had gone somewhere inaccessible. In a rural parish, where religion was woven into the moral fabric of life, this ambiguity could be especially difficult to manage. The line between fervor and instability was not always drawn with confidence until after a crisis had occurred. It is likely that those around Blanche attempted, for a time, to absorb what they could not explain. Families usually do. A change in behavior rarely leads immediately to official action. There are stages of tolerance, reinterpretation, concealment, and hope. Improvement is expected. Bad days are explained away. Strange remarks are dismissed. A troubling episode is treated as temporary. The sufferer is urged to rest, pray, eat properly, compose herself, be reasonable, Think of others, stop frightening the household, or simply get on with what needs doing. It is only when such efforts fail repeatedly, or when the behavior crosses into unmistakable danger, that a family begins to understand that the situation has exceeded its capacity. The silence around this process in the historical record does not mean it did not happen. It means only that what occurred was domestic, repeated, and not at first considered part of public history. In many 19th century cases, the path to disaster is built from moments never formally preserved. A conversation by the fire, a mother trying to soothe a daughter who cannot be soothed, a father insisting upon firmness where someone else suspects illness, a night disturbed by fear, a neighbor told only part of the truth, a minister asked for guidance, a doctor summoned too late or not at all. The absence of such scenes from the archive should not tempt one to imagine the period before the crime as blank. It was not blank. It was lived. And if Blanche's condition had already brought her into asylum care before the fatal act, as later accounts suggest, then her life had already crossed from family difficulty into institutional concern. This is a significant point. Admission to an asylum was not a minor event. It marked a social and emotional threshold. However imperfectly understood, the individual concerned had come to be seen as requiring more than private management. For a rural family, such a step could be painful, humiliating, relieving, or all three together. It exposed the household's inability to contain the problem unaided. It also altered the identity of the woman at the center of the crisis. She was no longer merely difficult, sorrowful, troubled, or strange. She had entered the machinery by which 19th century England classified those thought mentally unsound. Yet, even asylum contact did not guarantee lasting control or understanding. Institutions of the period varied enormously in philosophy, resources, and care. Some offered genuine attempts at treatment according to the standards of the day. Others were custodial above all. Diagnosis itself was unstable. Women whose symptoms may now suggest severe psychiatric disorder could be grouped together with those whose conduct was judged morally disruptive, sexually improper, emotionally unmanageable, or socially inconvenient. The medical and moral frameworks were entangled. A woman could leave such an institution labeled, observed, and still profoundly unwell. The fact that official care had once been involved did not mean a household was thereafter protected from further crisis. For Blanche, the period before the crime seems to have been one of deepening instability rather than recovery. The exact pace of that deterioration cannot now be measured. It may have been intermittent. There may have been days or weeks in which she appeared calmer. Families frequently seize upon such intervals as proof that the worst is past, only to find that it has not. Unstable mental states are often lived not as a straight descent, but as alternations between terror and uneasy hope. The household relaxes, then tenses again. The sufferer seems reachable, then suddenly distant. Ordinary life resumes just enough to make relapse more painful when it comes. What did Blanche herself feel during this time? The record offers almost nothing direct. That absence should not be filled too quickly with modern sentiment or convenient theory. It is possible she was frightened by her own thoughts. It is possible she felt persecuted, certain, ashamed, misunderstood, exalted, or all of these by turns. Severe mental disturbance can produce not only visible behavioral change, but a private world of conviction or distress inaccessible to those standing closest. If Blanche was living inside such a world, then the gap between her own experience and that of her family may have widened dangerously in the months or years before the shooting. They may have seen disobedience where she felt compulsion, irreverence where she felt spiritual urgency, hostility where she experienced dread. Equally, she may at times have recognized the distress she caused and been unable to master it. None of this softens the horror of what followed. But it does matter for understanding how a daughter in an apparently ordinary rural household moved towards an act so destructive that it would define her forever. Crimes within families rarely spring from nowhere. They emerge from contact prolonged under strain. The mother and daughter relationship is especially vulnerable to this. It is intimate, repetitive, emotionally loaded, and in the Victorian household often inseparable from discipline, duty, correction, and dependence. A daughter in mental collapse might cling to her mother, resist her, fear her, resent her, or rely upon her with painful intensity. A mother might love, supervise, excuse, confront, and dread all at once. Such bonds can become dangerously charged when one party is profoundly unwell and the other remains the primary source of everyday containment. This gives the pre-crime period of Blanche's life a tragic density, even where its exact incidents remain elusive. She did not begin as a monstrous figure at a distance from ordinary womanhood. She began within the expected structure of daughterhood itself. She belonged to a household. She worked within it. She moved under the same village scrutiny as others of her sex and class. If, as seems likely, her mind began to fail in ways that frightened those around her, then that failure occurred not in some dramatic Gothic isolation, but in the midst of ordinary tasks and familiar rooms. This is one of the darkest truths of domestic history. Breakdown happens not outside life, but inside it. The silence of rural communities can obscure that fact. A village may continue to look composed while a family within it is approaching crisis. Fields are tended. Market days come and go. Church attendance continues. Neighbors exchange greetings. The rhythm of outward life survives the inward strain of a particular household, but the household itself changes. Those inside it begin to organize themselves around uncertainty. They become alert to signs, fearful of moods, hopeful for calm, uncertain how to speak of what they know. Whatever Blanche had once been to her family in simpler years, she may gradually have become something more difficult to hold in language. Loved and feared, recognized and estranged, present and increasingly inaccessible. That transformation is essential to the story because it precedes the crime in moral importance, even if it does not surpass it in historical visibility. By the time a daughter kills her mother, something in the relationship between private suffering and public order has already failed. Whether that failure lies in the individual mind, in the family's exhausted management, in institutional inadequacy, or in all of these at once is rarely simple to determine. But the act itself is never the whole history. It is the point at which a longer process becomes undeniable. Blanche Bastable's life before the crime was therefore not merely a preface to violence. It was the setting in which the possibility of violence first took shape, though no one may yet have named it as such. It was the period in which expectations of femininity, obedience, religion, labor, and family order collided with the difficult reality of a woman who appears to have become increasingly unwell. It was the period in which the Bastable household, like many households under strain, may have gone on performing normal life while normality was steadily becoming impossible. In later years, memory would contract around the single terrible fact that Blanche shot her mother. But before that fact stood a young woman in a Dorset village, living under the ordinary demands of rural daughterhood and moving, step by uncertain step, towards a state that those around her could neither fully understand nor safely contain. The catastrophe had not yet occurred, but the conditions in which it would become possible were already present. And within the Bastable household, the distinction between trouble and danger was beginning to narrow. Chapter 3. A Daughter Unraveling. There is rarely a single moment at which a family can say, with certainty, that trouble has become danger. The change is more often gradual, and for that reason more difficult to face. What begins as strain is explained as fatigue. What appears alarming one week seems improved the next. Unusual conduct is dismissed as temperament, then reconsidered as nerves, then concealed as far as possible from outsiders. A household adjusts itself before it admits that adjustment has become its principal labor. By the time fear can no longer be denied, those inside the family have often been living with its smaller signs for some time. So it seems to have been in the Bastable home. If Blanche Bastable's life before the crime was shaped by increasing disturbance, then the next stage was not merely that she suffered, but that her suffering began to alter the emotional climate of the household around her. Distress, once it settles inside a family, is never borne by one person alone. It changes the circulation of speech, the rhythm of rooms, the meaning of silence, and the ordinary expectations of safety. In cases involving a daughter and her mother, these changes can be especially intimate and especially difficult to name. The relationship is too close, too habitual, and too loaded with obligation for simple descriptions to hold. The daughter remains the daughter, even when she begins to frighten. The mother remains the mother, even when she begins to fear her own child. In a rural Victorian household, that contradiction would not have been easy to express openly. The language available for female distress was plentiful but imprecise. It could describe without illuminating. A young woman might be called unsettled, excitable, low, difficult, peculiar, weak, willful, hysterical, deranged, or touched in the head, depending on who was speaking and what they hoped, feared, or wished to avoid. None of these descriptions necessarily captured the reality of living with a person whose moods, convictions, or behavior had become increasingly unstable. They were often the social language of approximation, the rough net cast over conduct that no longer felt ordinary. For a time, approximation can appear sufficient. Families are reluctant to abandon familiar explanations. They do not usually move at once from concern to catastrophe. It is far easier to believe that someone is merely overwrought than to accept that they may be ill in mind. Easier to say she is religiously overexcited than to consider that she is unreachable. Easier to hope for composure tomorrow than to ask what should be done if tomorrow is worse. This is not only denial. It is often a form of self-protection. To recognize the full seriousness of a loved one's deterioration is to recognize that the household itself may no longer be adequate to contain it. Such recognition comes at a cost. In a farming family like the Bastables, ordinary life could not simply be suspended while emotional crises were addressed. The work continued. Animals still needed tending. Meals had to be prepared. The daily structure of labor offered little room for breakdown, and less for those tasked with managing it. If Blanche became more agitated, suspicious, consumed by fixed ideas, or emotionally volatile, those around her would have had to make sense of that change while still meeting the demands of the day. There would have been no protected space in which to step back and calmly consider the matter. Disturbance entered directly into the working life of the home. This made it harder, not easier, to respond well. A troubled daughter could become at once an object of concern and an impediment to the functioning of the household. That duality is uncomfortable, but it is central to understanding domestic crises. Love does not erase fatigue. Compassion does not cancel fear. A mother may feel profound pity for a suffering child and, in the next moment, feel overwhelmed by the practical burden of supervising her, calming her, reasoning with her, or simply enduring another day shaped around her instability. A father may believe firmness is needed because firmness is what he understands, even as firmness worsens what he cannot explain. The family's response becomes a mixture of care, irritation, alarm, duty, and helplessness, all pressed together in the same small spaces. It is within such pressure that a daughter may begin, in the eyes of her own household, to change from troubled into frightening. That shift is one of the most painful in family life because it does not erase affection, and may even intensify it. The person feared is also the person remembered in earlier, gentler forms. Every alarming episode sits uneasily alongside the memory of who she once seemed to be. The result is not simple rejection, but instability in the family's own understanding. One day she is pitied. The next day she is watched. One day she appears calmer and hope returns. The next day something is said or done that restores the old dread with greater force. This fluctuation can go on for months, even years, before those involved are able to admit how grave the situation has become. The phrase later attached to Blanche, religious mania, suggests that her disturbance may have found expression in forms that were especially difficult for a Victorian household to manage. Religion, in the 19th century, was both ordinary and powerful. It shaped conduct, vocabulary, morality, and domestic expectation. A woman's piety could be admired, but only when it remained within recognizable bounds. Quiet devotion, conscientiousness, self-denial, scriptural seriousness, these could be praised. Religious intensity that tipped into obsession, fear, exaltation, or relentless moral fixation was another matter. Once faith became excessive in its outward manifestations, it risked being reinterpreted as a kind of derangement. And where the person affected was a young woman already causing strain, the category of mania could gather around her with alarming speed. Whether Blanche's religious disturbance was rooted in genuine spiritual terror, delusional conviction, or some fusion of the two cannot now be known with confidence. What matters is that those around her appear to have experienced it not as harmless eccentricity, but as evidence that something in her mind had become dangerously disordered. A daughter who spoke with inappropriate urgency, who seemed governed by unseen certainties, who passed beyond ordinary persuasion, or whose thoughts appeared driven by intense inward pressure would have been difficult to reassure and harder still to contain. If her condition involved fixed beliefs, moral dread, or emotional extremity, then attempts to calm her may have met with only temporary success or complete failure. The more unreachable she became, the more the household would have been forced into reactive modes, soothing, arguing, avoiding, praying, supervising, and waiting. Waiting is one of the least visible torments in such cases. A family living with instability does not live only in the moment of disturbance. It lives in anticipation of the next one. Calm itself becomes uncertain. A quiet afternoon does not restore ease. It merely prompts caution. The question beneath every ordinary activity becomes whether peace will hold. This kind of life alters the nervous system of a household. Voice is lower. Someone begins listening for footsteps, tone, movement. Doors are opened more carefully. Sharp objects are noticed. Certain topics are avoided. A mother may begin to calculate constantly how to speak, when to leave a room, whether to contradict, whether to placate, whether to remain close or keep distance. The mental strain of such vigilance rarely survives in formal records, but it is often one of the truest measures of what life inside the family had become. If Blanche's condition had worsened to the point that previous institutional care was sought, then the household had already crossed one important threshold. Yet, even then, the return from such care, if she did return, could have introduced a new and more difficult uncertainty. Families often hoped that intervention would restore order, only to find that whatever had been named elsewhere as illness remained disturbingly present at home. The knowledge that someone had already been judged in need of confinement or treatment could make subsequent episodes feel more dangerous, not less. It stripped away the comfort of imagining that nothing serious was wrong. At the same time, it may also have fostered hope that was painfully hard to surrender. A family does not easily stop hoping that a daughter will improve. Improvement is read into small changes. A quieter day, an apparently reasonable conversation, a period of cooperation. All can be taken as signs that the worst is passing. This is one reason domestic crises can deepen without decisive outside action. The intervals of apparent calm make endurance seem possible. They invite the household to resume normal expectations prematurely. But when the instability returns, it does so within a framework already weakened by exhaustion and disappointed hope. For a mother, that cycle could be particularly cruel. The Victorian mother occupied a position both intimate and burdensome. She was expected to hold the emotional center of the household while also managing its practical life. Her labor was often invisible precisely because it was constant. If Blanche's behavior had become erratic or frightening, Elizabeth Bastable would likely have carried much of the immediate work of response. She would have been near enough to notice changes early, exposed enough to bear the repeated strain of them, and obligated enough by both affection and social expectation to continue trying to manage what was becoming unmanageable. This is not speculation in the melodramatic sense. It is simply how such households functioned. The mother was the first line of emotional containment because there was rarely anyone else to perform that role. That role, however, did not make her safe. There is a tragic pattern in many domestic crimes involving mentally disturbed adult children. The person most burdened with care becomes the person most exposed to harm. Familiarity breeds not only knowledge, but access. The mother is present for the moods, the arguments, the silences, the breakdowns, the fragile reconciliations. She becomes the one who must approach when others withdraw, the one who still enters the room, still attempts to soothe, still speaks when no one else knows what to say. In doing so, she stands closest to whatever danger the family has not yet fully named. If the Bastable household had begun to live under such conditions, then daily life would have become charged in ways outsiders might never have fully seen. This is one of the unsettling features of rural domestic history. A family can be approaching catastrophe while continuing to look externally intact. Work is done. Appearances are maintained. The lane outside remains quiet. Neighbors hear something, perhaps, or suspect something, but the household continues to present itself through the forms of ordinary life. Even where concern becomes visible, it is often only partially legible. Others may notice that Blanche is changed, that she seems unlike herself, that her conduct has become difficult, that there is strain in the house. but they do not inhabit the private atmosphere in which fear is becoming habitual. And fear, once habitual, reshapes love without extinguishing it. This is why cases such as Blanche Bastable's resist easy moral simplification. It is too simple to imagine the household as purely tender until madness intruded, and equally too simple to imagine it as a place of relentless conflict. Reality was likely more unstable than either picture. There may have been moments of pity so sharp they felt unbearable. There may have been anger at behaviour no one could endure calmly. There may have been shame, especially if neighbors noticed and spoke. There may have been guilt at feeling irritation towards someone manifestly unwell. Families in these situations often move between protectiveness and resentment, between sympathy and frustration, in ways that later generations find difficult to describe without judgment. Yet these contradictions are part of the truth. The daughter herself, meanwhile, may have been moving further from ordinary relational life than anyone around her realized. Serious mental breakdown can produce not only outward disturbance, but a change in the sufferer's relation to others. The mother may no longer appear as mother in the familiar sense. She may become implicated in fears, resented as a restraining force, clung to with desperate dependence, or perceived through distorted meanings no one else can fully access. If Blanche's mind had entered such territory, then the ordinary structures of daughterhood, obedience, affection, correction, shared routine, would have grown increasingly unstable. The relationship could continue externally while inwardly altering beyond recognition. This helps explain why domestic violence arising from mental collapse can feel so incomprehensible to those outside it. Observers see the familiar roles and cannot reconcile them with the act. A daughter, a mother, a country home. They expect continuity between those terms and discover instead that the emotional reality inside the relationship had been shifting for some time. What looked fixed from the outside had in fact become fragile. What looked intimate had become dangerous. What looked ordinary had become strained beyond endurance. None of this makes the eventual violence inevitable. It matters to resist that false backward certainty. Many households endure severe distress without fatal outcome. Many women become mentally unwell without harming others. Many families struggle and yet do not collapse into irrevocable tragedy. To trace a pattern of unraveling is not to claim that the end was predetermined. It is only to say that the conditions from which the end emerged were serious, and that the signs of worsening danger were likely present before the final act forced everyone to see them. That forcing point is always brutal. Until then, uncertainty governs. A family asks itself whether matters are truly as bad as they seem. It waits for improvement, dreads escalation, and continues through routine because routine is all that remains within its power. The line between caution and alarm narrows slowly. Then one incident, often not the first frightening one, but the one that cannot be explained away, changes everything. Afterwards, all earlier episodes are reread as warnings. The household's history rearranges itself around the moment that ended denial. In Blanche Bastable's case, the period before that moment was one of increasing emotional instability, deepening household strain, and the apparent failure of ordinary domestic structures to contain what was happening to her. The village may still have appeared quiet. The farm may still have continued in its work. But within the Bastable home, peace had likely become conditional, fragile, and exhausting to maintain. The daughter once understood through familiar rural expectations had begun to exceed them. Her conduct, whatever exact form it took from day to day, had moved beyond mere difficulty. Those nearest to her were no longer simply coping with temperament or sorrow. They were living in relation to a mind that seemed increasingly beyond ordinary reach. That is the true meaning of unraveling in a domestic context. It is not merely that one person changes. It is that the household begins to lose its own coherence in response. Roles remain, but certainty drains from them. The mother continues to mother, but now under threat. The father continues to govern, but without mastery. The daughter remains physically present while becoming less recognizable in spirit. The home continues to function, but at the cost of constant adjustment. It is this erosion, slow, intimate, exhausting, that so often precedes acts later described as shocking, sudden, or monstrous. By the time such words are used, the family has already lived much of the catastrophe in quieter form. Blanche Bastable's story had reached that stage. Whatever stillness East Orchard seemed to possess from the outside, the Bastable household was moving towards a point at which ordinary life could no longer bear the weight placed upon it. The distinctions that had once governed the family, between piety and mania, distress and danger, daughter and threat, home and refuge, were beginning to collapse. The crime had not yet been committed, but the house in which it would occur was already no longer at peace. And in that narrowing space between fear and recognition, the final disaster was drawing near. Chapter 4. The Fair, the Gun, the Fatal Moment. By the time violence enters a household, it is often preceded by a strange and terrible doubleness. Outward life continues. The road is still used. Meals are still prepared. Animals are still tended. The ordinary markers of time remain in place. Yet beneath that continuity, another reality has begun to assert itself, one shaped by tension, fear, watchfulness, and the unstable moods of someone no longer fully held within the old boundaries of family life. What is most disturbing, when looking back upon such cases, is not only the violence itself, but the proximity of that violence to the ordinary. The two do not stand far apart. They exist side by side until one suddenly overtakes the other. So it appears to have been in the Bastable household. The period immediately before the fatal act is not preserved in full detail. No record can now restore every conversation, every movement through the house, every small effort at calm, or every failed attempt at ordinary domestic routine. What later survives tends to reduce the event to its bare essentials. The daughter, the weapon, the mother dead. But within any family crime, the final act is never experienced first as summary. It emerges from a sequence of minutes and decisions, of gestures and pauses, of conditions already present and suddenly made irreversible. To reconstruct that sequence with any honesty requires attention not only to what happened, but to the atmosphere in which it became possible. One detail associated with Blanche Bastable's case stands out with particular force: that she is said to have practiced with a gun at Shroton Fair shortly before she shot her mother. Whether remembered precisely in every small particular or preserved through later retelling, the detail matters because of what it suggests. It places the weapon first in a public setting, amongst the noise and movement of a country fair, before it reappears in the private interior of home. It creates a dreadful continuity between festivity and death, between an object handled in open company and that same object turned, soon after, upon the most intimate of familial relations. It is one of those historical details that acquire symbolic weight precisely because it is so ordinary in itself. A fair was not a place of mourning or dread. It was a place of temporary diversion, commerce, spectatorship, and local congregation. To connect it with the killing that followed is to feel how quickly the familiar world can darken without changing its outward form. The rural fair occupied an important place in 19th century life. It interrupted routine without entirely escaping it. People came together who otherwise remained occupied in the dispersed labor of farms, cottages, and parishes. There were stalls, entertainments, livestock, noise, laughter, observation, and all the mingled strains of sociability and roughness that such gatherings encouraged. A fair was public, but not formal. It allowed temporary looseness within a culture otherwise governed by visible propriety and repeated duty. For young people especially, it could offer excitement, novelty, or release from the monotony of village rhythms. That such a place should enter the history of Blanche Bastable's crime lends the case a particular sharpness. It suggests not some remote preparation in secret, but a movement through the ordinary life of the countryside itself. The weapon, once handled, altered the field of possibility. A gun in a household already burdened by instability is not merely an object. It is a latent event. Perhaps no one around Blanche, at the moment the gun was taken up or used for practice, fully grasped the danger. Rural life was not wholly unfamiliar with firearms. They existed within agricultural and sporting culture, and their presence, while not casual in every household, did not automatically signal impending crime. Yet in retrospect the detail becomes intolerably charged. What might have seemed to others a passing amusement, or at worst an imprudent indulgence, now appears as the immediate prelude to catastrophe. This is one of the cruelest features of historical hindsight. Once the ending is known, earlier moments glow with warning. The fair becomes ominous. The handling of the weapon becomes a signal. The day itself seems marked in advance. But it would not necessarily have felt so to those living it. People almost never inhabit the final prelude to tragedy with the clarity that later narration gives it. They move through their hours as they have through previous hours, alert, perhaps, uneasy, perhaps, but not yet certain that what is feared will in fact occur. The fatal act remains only one possibility until the instant it ceases to be merely possible. For Blanche, however, the acquisition or recent use of a gun seems to have brought her inner disorder into direct contact with physical means. This conjunction is vital. Mental unraveling alone does not explain family murder, nor does access to a weapon alone. What makes the moment before the killing historically and morally significant is the meeting of a disturbed mind, a strained domestic setting, and an instrument capable of instant irreversible harm. Where tension has become habitual, the presence of a weapon transforms the household. Even if no one speaks of it, the danger changes in kind. Fear no longer concerns only words, agitation, or emotional volatility. It becomes mortal. The exact course of the day on which Elizabeth Bastable was shot cannot now be recovered with complete certainty, but the shape of the event can still be approached through what is known of domestic crime. Within such households, violence often emerges not from a grand theatrical build, but from the collapse of whatever fragile arrangements have been preserving temporary calm. A disagreement, a contradiction, a refusal, a fixed idea pursued to its limit, an ordinary act suddenly experienced as intolerable, any of these can become the immediate occasion. The final trigger, however, should not be mistaken for the whole cause. It is only the point at which accumulated instability finds expression in action. To isolate a single exchange and call it the explanation is to misunderstand the nature of domestic crisis. What kills in such cases is not merely the final quarrel, if there was one, but the long deterioration that made the quarrel dangerous. The household in which the shooting took place was not a neutral stage. It was the same domestic world already strained by Blanche's worsening mental state. Its rooms had likely held anxiety for some time. Its routines had likely been altered by vigilance, caution, and fatigue. The mother at the center of it, Elizabeth Bastable, had almost certainly been carrying the ordinary burdens of domestic labor alongside the extraordinary burden of trying to live with a daughter whose conduct had become frightening. In this sense, the fatal moment did not descend upon an unsuspecting paradise. It arrived in a house already worn thin by emotional strain. And yet that does not lessen the horror. It may in fact deepen it. The murder of a mother by her daughter wounds not only because of the act, but because of what the relationship signifies. The mother is conventionally imagined as protector, guide, moral center, and daily companion of the home. The daughter is expected to receive care, discipline, and instruction under that authority. To see that order broken by lethal violence is to see domestic life itself turn against its own form. Whatever disagreements, fears, or pressures preceded the act, the final reality remained the same. A daughter used a gun against her mother. The violence of the method also matters. Shooting is immediate, decisive, and difficult to reconcile with sentimental accounts of female violence. Victorian culture often imagined women's crimes, where they occurred, in forms more secretive or indirect: poisoning, concealment, deceit, influence. A firearm disrupted those assumptions. It carried force, noise, visibility, and finality. A daughter with a gun did not fit easily within the cultural grammar of femininity. This would have added to the shock surrounding the case. The act was not merely murderous. It was violently out of keeping with what a woman, and particularly a daughter, was supposed to be. That very mismatch may have intensified the readiness to interpret Blanche through insanity. Where a woman's conduct so sharply contradicted social expectation, contemporaries often reached quickly for explanations that placed her outside ordinary female nature altogether. This did not necessarily reflect compassion. It could reflect horror just as readily. To call a woman insane was sometimes to acknowledge suffering, but it was also to push her beyond the boundaries of recognizable womanhood. In Blanche Bastable's case, the shooting of her mother by firearm would almost certainly have appeared to many observers as the action of someone whose mind had passed beyond reason, morality, or natural feeling. For those closest to the event, however, public interpretation came later. First, there was the shock within the home itself. Whatever exact sequence of movement led to the shooting, the aftermath would have been immediate, chaotic, and irreversible. Gun violence interrupts domestic time with brutal efficiency. One moment belongs to strain, argument, fear, or unstable calm. The next belongs to injury, noise, blood, disbelief, and the dawning knowledge that what has happened cannot be undone. There is no gentle transition. The house itself becomes newly strange. Familiar rooms are altered at once by the presence of violence. Every ordinary object remains, but the meaning of the space has changed. For a rural family, the practical aftermath would have begun almost instantly. Help had to be summoned. Neighbors may have been alerted. Someone had to enter the house not as visitor or acquaintance, but as witness to a domestic disaster. In village life, the threshold between private and public could be crossed in a moment once serious injury occurred. A matter previously contained within the family became at once communal knowledge. The same community that had perhaps observed strain from a distance was now confronted with its most dreadful conclusion. This is one reason domestic murder in small places carries a particular force. It does not remain abstract. It enters memory through specific houses, specific kinships, and familiar names. Elizabeth Bastable, at the center of this catastrophe, is too easily overshadowed by the later fascination with Blanche. Yet in the fatal moment, it was Elizabeth who experienced the full violence of the act. Before she became the murdered mother of the record, she had been a working woman of the household, likely carrying all the accumulated fatigue, care, and emotional labor that rural motherhood required. To restore her to the scene is not merely an act of sympathy, it is an act of historical balance. Domestic crime is distorted whenever the victim disappears behind the strangeness of the perpetrator. What happened in the Bastable home was not only that Blanche crossed a terrible boundary, it was that Elizabeth's ordinary life was brought to an abrupt and violent end within the very domestic sphere she had helped sustain. The emotional force of matricide lies partly in this reversal. The home, which should have sheltered her, became the site of her death. The daughter, to whom she was bound by the deepest forms of daily familiarity, became the source of mortal harm. Such reversals have always exerted a particular power over the social imagination because they seem to reveal a hidden instability beneath the most cherished forms of order. If a mother is not safe with her daughter, then what, in the sentimental architecture of domestic ideology, remains secure? After the shot was fired, that question would have moved rapidly from private horror to public meaning. Neighbors, officials, and later readers would all seek explanation. But explanation is often most elusive precisely where its demand is strongest. Why did the final moment come when it did? Why then, rather than earlier or later? Why in that room, that hour, that mood? Some questions cannot be answered beyond probability. The person who acts under severe mental disturbance may not be able to provide coherent motive. Those present may remember only fragments. Later retellings simplify what was chaotic. The result is that the crime acquires a stark outline without yielding full understanding. This incompleteness is part of the honesty owed to the case. It is possible to say that Blanche shot her mother. It is possible to note the preceding disturbance, the apparent religious mania, the connection to the fair and the gun, and the later conclusion that she belonged not in ordinary penal categories, but among the criminally insane. It is not possible to enter completely into the final workings of her mind at the instant of violence. Nor is it possible to know every thought that passed through Elizabeth's in the seconds before. The historian's duty in such moments is not to invent certainty for dramatic effect, but to preserve the gravity of what can be known and the silence of what cannot. What can be known is enough to show that the Bastable household crossed, in that moment, from strain into irrevocable ruin. Whatever hope had existed before, hope of management, improvement, recovery, or continued endurance, was destroyed by the act. The private ordeal of living with Blanche's instability became a matter for law, medicine, and public judgment. The village's whispered concern hardened into confirmed horror. A mother was dead. A daughter had killed her. No language of nerves, excitability, or difficult behavior could contain the reality any longer. The fair, in retrospect, becomes the final ordinary scene before this collapse. Its bustle and sociability belong to the world as it still appeared. The house after the shooting belongs to another world entirely, one in which every prior unease is suddenly reinterpreted as warning, every act of forbearance as part of a path towards disaster, every family effort at containment as tragically inadequate. This is how domestic murder remakes memory. It divides time into before and after with a force few other events can match. Before, there was still uncertainty. After, there was only consequence. And consequence moved swiftly. The death of Elizabeth Bastable was not something the family, or the village, or the authorities could absorb quietly. It demanded response. That response would soon place Blanche within the formal language of criminal law and mental disorder, transferring her from the intimate world of daughterhood and household crisis into the far colder structures of the state. But before courts, doctors, and institutional categories claimed her, there was this single fact from which all else followed. In a Dorset home, after a period of evident mental disturbance, Blanche Bastable raised a gun and killed her mother. Nothing written afterwards could soften that fact. Nothing written afterwards could restore the life taken. And nothing written afterwards could return the Bastable home to the ordinary silence in which, not long before, it had seemed to stand. Chapter 5. Murder, Madness, and the Victorian Eye. Once violence has broken the privacy of a household, the language surrounding it changes with remarkable speed. What had previously belonged to family strain, private fear, repeated adjustment, and uncertain hope is seized upon by larger systems of interpretation. Neighbors speak. Officials arrive. The event is reported, classified, and retold. The domestic becomes public. The particular becomes exemplary. A woman whose conduct had once been understood, however imperfectly, within the changing atmosphere of a home is now read through the harsher and more formal categories of law, medicine, and social judgment. Whatever remained ambiguous inside the house begins, from that point, to harden into narrative. So it was with Blanche Bastable. After the shooting of her mother, the question was no longer whether there had been disturbance in the Bastable household. Disturbance had become undeniable. The death of Elizabeth Bastable transformed private instability into a matter that demanded explanation from the wider world. In a small rural community, that process would have been immediate and intimate. The people called upon to witness, assist, or speak of the event were not strangers. They were neighbors, parish associates, local figures, perhaps men and women who had seen some earlier sign of strain without fully understanding it. Once the fact of the killing stood plain, whatever had formerly been whispered, softened, doubted, or dismissed would have been drawn back into circulation with new force. This is one of the grim mechanics of domestic crime. A family's private history is retrospectively reorganized by catastrophe. Incidents that once seemed isolated become warnings. Behavior once tolerated as difficult is reclassified as dangerous. What had been interpreted with hesitation now appears obvious in hindsight. The community convinces itself, sometimes sincerely, that the signs were there all along. Often they were. But signs look different after blood has been shed. The ordinary uncertainty of living with a troubled person is forgotten, and in its place grows a retrospective clarity more satisfying than truthful. Even so, the killing of Elizabeth Bastable would have made certain things impossible to ignore. A daughter had shot her mother. No 19th century audience, rural or urban, could receive such a fact without moral shock. The act violated not only the law, but one of the deepest emotional and symbolic arrangements of Victorian domestic life. The mother was supposed to embody care, restraint, and continuity. The daughter was supposed to stand beneath that care, receiving guidance and correction within the accepted hierarchy of the home. The murder shattered that arrangement in a way that was both literal and cultural. It was not merely that a person had been killed. It was that the killing had emerged from the very relationship expected to secure the moral order of the household. For this reason, the case would almost inevitably be read through a language of abnormality. Ordinary vice did not seem sufficient to explain it. The blunt categories used for drunken assault, theft, or common brutality sat uneasily beside the image of a daughter turning a gun upon her mother. If a man committed violence, however terrible, society possessed familiar ways of accounting for him. Drink, rage, bad character, long-standing criminality, roughness, greed, lust, or cruelty. A woman, and especially a daughter in a rural household, presented a different interpretive problem. Her violence seemed to require either moral monstrosity or mental derangement, and often both were suggested at once. This is where the Victorian eye becomes especially revealing. The 19th century did not simply observe female violence, it strained to render it intelligible within pre-existing ideas about womanhood. A woman who killed was rarely allowed to remain merely a person who had committed an act. She was more often transformed into a type. She might become the unnatural woman, the fallen woman, the hysterical woman, the mad woman, the coarse woman, the poisonous woman, the godless woman, or some combination of these figures. In Blanche Bastable's case, the emerging interpretation appears to have leaned strongly towards insanity. Her earlier disturbance, the references to religious mania, and the extremity of the act made that reading both available and, to contemporaries, perhaps unavoidable. But insanity, in Victorian usage, was not a simple or purely medical category. It sat at the meeting point of medicine, morality, law, religion, and social unease. To call someone insane might express pity, fear, revulsion, or administrative necessity. It could protect a person from the full penalties of ordinary criminal justice, yet still place them within a regime of lifelong control. It could acknowledge suffering, while also stripping them of credibility and pushing them outside the recognized bounds of normal human accountability. When the label attached to a woman, it often carried additional force, because it suggested not only mental collapse but a deviation from femininity itself. A madwoman was not simply ill. She was a woman whose conduct had become incompatible with domestic order. Blanche's case fitted that framework with terrible efficiency. She was a rural daughter, attached to a respectable enough domestic world, whose conduct had apparently worsened into religious and emotional disturbance before culminating in a violent act against her mother. This sequence would have seemed to many contemporaries like the very pattern by which female disorder revealed itself. First excess, then instability, then danger, then catastrophe. The interpretation may have been partly accurate in terms of mental illness, but it was never neutral. The story was being told through assumptions already present in the culture, assumptions about what women were supposed to be and what it meant when they failed or refused to remain so. In the immediate aftermath, practical and legal processes would have begun quickly. A violent death in a rural household did not remain long in the realm of family explanation. There would have been official attention, inquiries, and the gathering of statements. The local community, however small, was linked to broader structures of law that expected such deaths to be named, examined, and brought under procedural order. The household itself, which had only recently been the site of ordinary labor and worsening emotional strain, now became a place of evidence. Rooms would be inspected not for comfort or utility, but for facts. Speech would be recorded or repeated not for family negotiation, but for legal significance. In this way, one of the most intimate settings of life was converted into an administrative scene. Such transformation can feel almost indecent in its speed. The emotional logic of the house, all its habits, tensions, care, resentment, exhaustion, and fear, was of limited interest to official systems except insofar as it supported a conclusion. What mattered was what had happened, who had done it, whether the act could be proved, and what category of guilt or mental incapacity might now be applied. This is not because officials lacked all human sympathy. It is because institutions require compression. They cannot easily hold the full moral density of domestic life. They reduce. They sort. They proceed. Blanche herself, under this gaze, would have changed status almost at once. She was no longer merely the troubled daughter at the center of a household crisis. She was the woman who had killed her mother. If she had previously inspired worry or local sympathy, she now inspired fear and shocked scrutiny. The private suffering that may have preceded the act did not disappear, but it became inseparable from the violence that followed. This is often the fate of mentally disturbed offenders. Their illness becomes legible to the world only through the injury they inflict, and from then on is remembered chiefly as the explanation for that injury. Yet explanation is not exoneration. Victorian society understood this well, even when its categories were inconsistent. A person might be mad and still dangerous, disordered and still terrifying, ill and still subject to confinement. The figure of the criminal lunatic embodied precisely this uneasy overlap. Such a person was not simply a patient because a crime had occurred, nor were they merely a criminal because their mental state was judged to have compromised ordinary responsibility. The category was not merciful in any simple sense. It removed the offender from the standard moral and legal order and placed them into a more ambiguous system, one defined by indefinite control and enduring suspicion. This was particularly true for women. Female offenders judged insane occupied a space of peculiar fascination and anxiety. They unsettled the public imagination not only through what they had done, but through what they seemed to represent. The collapse of feminine restraint, the failure of domestic influence, the hidden violence of the home, and the possibility that madness in women might lie concealed behind ordinary household appearances. Women such as Blanche Bastable could therefore be read not only as individual tragedies, but as warnings. Their cases were made to speak beyond themselves. They confirmed, for many observers, the danger of uncontrolled female feeling, uncontrolled religion, or any emotional intensity that appeared to exceed the disciplined virtues expected of daughters and wives. This broad symbolic use of the case came at a cost. The more Blanche was interpreted as an example, the less room remained for the irreducibly personal dimensions of what had happened in the Bastable home. The ordinary history of one family gave way to a cautionary tale about madness, womanhood, or domestic danger. That process did not require conscious cruelty. It was built into the way 19th-century society processed disturbing events. Individual lives were continually made to illustrate larger moral truths. A daughter who killed her mother could thus become, in public thought, not only Blanche Bastable, but the embodiment of female derangement carried to its dreadful conclusion. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Bastable risked being overshadowed in a different way. Once the killing became a public matter, the dead mother could easily recede behind the strangeness of the daughter. The focus turned naturally towards the question of Blanche's mind, Blanche's conduct, Blanche's future disposal by the law. Elizabeth, whose death had made all this public attention necessary, could be reduced to the role of victim without further substance. This is a familiar distortion in true crime history, especially in family cases. The person killed becomes a fixed point around which argument circulates, while the one who killed continues to generate narrative, interpretation, and fascination. But Elizabeth's death had a social and emotional meaning beyond its legal function. She was not simply the body through which the case proceeded. She was the woman who had occupied the center of that household's daily life. In a rural farming family, a mother's labor was constant, practical, and indispensable. Her death meant the destruction not only of a person, but of a domestic role that could not easily be replaced. It altered the entire family economy of care, work, memory, and authority. The public case would eventually classify and contain what had happened. The family itself, however, had to endure the void it created. In village life, that void did not remain private for long. The smaller the community, the more deeply a domestic killing entered communal memory. People knew the house. They knew the family name. They may have known enough of the previous strain to feel retrospective unease or guilt. A parish absorbs such events into its long recollection. Even when newspapers move on, the village continues to live in relation to what occurred. The road past the house remains. The names remain. The knowledge remains. Domestic murder lingers in local memory precisely because it disrupts the illusion that close communities are naturally safe from the darkest forms of human violence. The press, had it taken notice in any lasting way, would have been shaped by similar instincts, though with a different purpose. Victorian reporting on crime often balanced moralism with appetite. Shocking cases were presented in ways that offered readers both instruction and sensation. Female offenders were especially useful to this style of writing because they combined the unexpected with the morally charged. A woman who killed could be made to appear monstrous, pitiable, cautionary, or all three in quick succession. Language of madness was often particularly convenient. It rendered the case dramatic without requiring social structures to be examined too closely. The focus remained on the aberrant woman rather than on the conditions under which breakdown and violence had developed. That tendency matters because it shaped how cases such as Blanche's were remembered. Once the category of the madwoman attaches to a woman who is killed, it becomes difficult to recover the ordinary human history that preceded the label. Everything moves backwards from the crime. Childhood, daughterhood, work, religious life, family strain, emotional decline. all are reread through the final act. The person becomes, retrospectively, always on the road to that outcome. Yet no life feels like that while it is being lived. The Bastable family would not have experienced themselves as participants in a cautionary narrative. They would have experienced a worsening and frightening household reality for which no one possessed sufficient remedy. Still, the public world required a verdict of interpretation. Was Blanche wicked? Was she mad? Was she both? Could a daughter who killed her mother be understood as morally accountable in the same way as an ordinary murderer? Or had her mind departed so far from reason that another framework was required? These questions were not merely theoretical. They determined what would happen to her next. They shaped whether she would be processed through the ordinary punitive machinery of the law or moved into the distinct and developing apparatus built for those whose crimes and mental states were judged inseparable. The answer emerging around her seems to have been that her crime belonged to the latter category. That answer did not erase public horror. It organized it. By placing Blanche within the domain of madness, Victorian society found a way to speak of the incomprehensible without admitting that ordinary domestic life itself could harbor such devastation. Insanity became both explanation and barrier. It made the crime narratable, while also isolating it from the supposedly healthy world around it. The Bastable home could then be imagined as tragic because invaded by derangement, rather than as one instance of how fragile the ideal of domestic order had always been. This distinction, though comforting, was never entirely honest. The case disturbed precisely because it showed that the borders between normal household life and uncontainable crisis were not as strong as Victorian ideology claimed. Blanche Bastable was not an outsider who entered the home to destroy it. She was produced within its own structures. She was a daughter of the house, not an intruder from beyond it. To name her mad was perhaps correct in part, but it also allowed society to avoid a deeper discomfort. That the domestic sphere it idealized was fully capable of producing unbearable strain, failed understanding, and mortal violence. By the end of the immediate aftermath, then, the meaning of the case had already begun to shift. It was no longer simply a family tragedy in a Dorset parish. It had become a matter through which Victorian England could contemplate, at a manageable distance, the frightening intersection of female violence, mental collapse, and domestic disorder. Blanche stood at the center of that contemplation, but not on her own terms. She was being translated into the categories available to her age, and those categories would determine the course of the rest of her life. The daughter who had once existed within the ordinary expectations of rural womanhood now stood under a harsher gaze. She was looked at as murderer. She was looked at as madwoman. And in the uneasy space between those two identities, the next stage of her story would unfold. Chapter 6. The Trial Without Redemption. Once a domestic crime enters the legal world, it is made to submit to forms that do not recognize grief except as evidence. This is not because the law is indifferent to suffering. It is because the law cannot operate in the language by which families usually understand themselves. It does not ask what a household felt like to live in over months of strain. It does not dwell for long on the accumulated fatigue of a mother, the confusion of neighbors, or the impossible position of a family trying to manage what it could not properly name. It asks instead for sequence, witness, fact, cause, responsibility, and category. It seeks order after disorder, and in doing so it necessarily strips away much of the emotional texture that made the event what it was. For Blanche Bastable, this meant that the catastrophe in the Bastable home was translated into a formal question. What was to be done with a daughter who had killed her mother? The answer could not be left to private horror, village opinion, or religious judgment alone. Victorian England had built elaborate systems for processing acts of violence, and even in a rural case those systems would gather around the crime with procedural inevitability. There would be depositions, official findings, legal assessments, and some form of court scrutiny. What had happened in the intimate space of the home now belonged to a framework in which intimacy counted only insofar as it clarified motive, state of mind, or circumstance. A mother and daughter ceased, in legal language, to be simply themselves. They became victim and accused. This transformation is one of the starkest moments in any true crime history. The dead are reduced to particulars necessary for proof. The living are rearranged into legal persons. Memory is formalized. Speech is narrowed. A room where people once ate, worked, worried, and endured becomes the site of an offense. The final moments of a human relationship are broken into questions of act and intent. Even where mercy is possible, it is a mercy articulated through rules rather than tenderness. The law can decide not to hang someone. It cannot restore the ordinary life through which the tragedy once moved. In a case such as Blanche's, the legal process would have been shadowed from the beginning by the question of insanity. This was not a minor side issue, nor a sympathetic embellishment. It was central. The killing itself was clear enough in its broad outline. The deeper problem was whether Blanche could be understood as criminal in the usual sense. Had she acted with the kind of reason and intent the law ordinarily required in order to punish fully? Or had her mind become so disordered that she stood in a different relation to her act altogether? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were the questions upon which her fate would turn. Victorian law, though often severe, was not blind to madness. By the 19th century, legal systems in Britain had already developed frameworks for distinguishing between ordinary offenders and those judged insane at the time of their crimes. These frameworks were uneven, contested, and often applied imperfectly, but they were powerful nonetheless. The category, sometimes rendered as guilty but insane, or its related forms, allowed the state to acknowledge the commission of a grave act while withholding the ordinary penal conclusion. Such a verdict was not freedom. It was another kind of captivity, often indefinite, in which the offender was removed from both common life and common punishment. For Blanche Bastable, this meant the courtroom was unlikely to provide anything resembling redemption. There would be no narrative in which she stood, confessed in full moral clarity, and was restored to humanity by the elegance of remorse. Nor would there be a narrative in which she was simply declared blameless and returned to private life under a cloud of pity. Victorian courts were not designed for such emotional resolutions, particularly in cases involving a murdered mother and an accused daughter already associated with serious disturbance. What the legal machinery sought was not healing, but disposition. It aimed to decide the appropriate category into which Blanche should now be placed, and then to move her into it. That coldness is part of what gives the legal aftermath its peculiar power. Domestic murder, before reaching court, still belongs partly to the language of sorrow and shock. Once it reaches official hearing, it enters a world of formulae. Counsel speak. Witnesses answer. Doctors or local observers may be called upon to describe behavior. Previous episodes are summarized. Character is weighed not in the round, but for its relevance. Strange conduct that terrified a household for months may be compressed into a few lines about prior derangement, religious excitement, or dangerous disposition. The richness of lived misery is flattened into admissible significance. This flattening was especially brutal for women. A woman on trial for violence was already confronted by assumptions about her sex. If she appeared calm, that calm could be read as unnatural hardness. If she appeared emotional, it could be read as further evidence of instability. If she was quiet, silence invited speculation. If she spoke strangely, her speech became material for the diagnosis of madness. The accused woman rarely had access to a posture that would restore her dignity in the eyes of the court. She stood already transformed by accusation, by gendered expectation, and, in Blanche's case, by the terrible intimacy of the act itself. To kill one's mother was to arrive before the law already burdened by symbolism. The crime did not only violate statute, it violated one of the most cherished emotional structures of Victorian society. A daughter was expected to owe reverence, obedience, or at the very least recognize dependency to her mother. That this relation had ended in fatal gun violence made the case morally monstrous even before legal classification began. The courtroom therefore confronted not merely a homicide, but a deeply disordered domestic image. The child turned destroyer, the maternal figure rendered vulnerable in her own home, the family bond converted into the site of death. This would have lent the proceedings a severity beyond what the bare legal facts might otherwise suggest. Yet at the same time, the extremity of the crime likely strengthened the case for insanity. There was a cultural logic to this. Some acts seemed too aberrant to fit ordinary moral reasoning. A daughter who shot her mother with a gun after signs of mental disturbance and what later sources call religious mania did not sit comfortably within the image of a calculating, recognizably self-interested criminal. She seemed instead to belong to that uneasy territory where law deferred, reluctantly, to medicine, or at least to a medical legal conception of disturbed mind. This did not mean that contemporaries viewed her with softness. Rather, they may have found insanity the only available category capable of containing their horror. This should not be mistaken for compassion in the modern sense. To be judged insane in connection with a murder was not to be embraced as a patient in need of healing. It was to be marked as profoundly dangerous in a way that ordinary prison did not adequately address. The insane offender threatened in two directions at once: through the crime already committed and through the unpredictability attributed to the mind that had committed it. Confinement under such a judgment was often more indefinite, more morally isolating, and in some ways more existentially devastating than a conventional sentence. The offender was neither reintegrated nor allowed the finality of ordinary punishment. She was held in a suspended condition between criminality and illness. That suspension is what makes this chapter of Blanche's story feel so stark. The trial, or trial-like legal proceeding, could not return her to daughterhood. It could not restore the household relation through which she had once been understood. Nor could it provide a morally satisfying ending in which guilt, punishment, and justice aligned neatly. Instead, it moved her into a different identity altogether. She became a woman of the state's concern, a figure to be managed, contained, classified, and hidden from ordinary domestic life. The law did not redeem her. It absorbed her. The evidence used in such proceedings would likely have included not only the act itself, but earlier testimony about Blanche's conduct. In cases where insanity was at issue, prior behavior mattered greatly. Witnesses might be asked about her speech, habits, emotional disturbances, religious fixations, previous confinement, and any episodes that suggested derangement. Family members, neighbors, and local authorities might all contribute fragments. Yet these fragments would have been shaped by the retrospective force of the crime. After a mother had been shot, every strange remark acquired a new gravity. Every past incident was reread as warning. What might once have seemed ambiguous now looked decisive. The court, in turn, would convert such recollections into a narrative of deteriorated mind. There is truth in such narratives, but also danger. They explain by compression. The more coherent the court's picture of Blanche's madness became, the easier it was to forget how confused and uneven the actual experience of living with her may have been. Domestic life under strain seldom presents itself in orderly sequence. It is jagged, repetitive, contradictory. The courtroom prefers progression. She was troubled, she worsened, she became deranged, she killed. Such order is administratively useful. It is not always experientially exact. Still, it is often all the historical record leaves behind. The legal process would also have had the effect of redistributing authority over Blanche's meaning. Inside the household, however falteringly, her condition had been interpreted through kinship as daughterly distress, disruption, fear, burden, perhaps sorrow. Once in the legal arena, that interpretive power shifted to magistrates, lawyers, doctors, and state representatives. The family no longer controlled the story of what she was. Indeed, the family itself may have been partly displaced by the official story, its own emotional confusion subordinated to the need for a clear legal outcome. This is one of the bitter ironies of such cases. The people who knew the sufferer most intimately often lose authority over her fate at the very moment their suffering becomes most public. For Elizabeth Bastable, of course, the law could do even less. The dead mother was present in the court only through injury, testimony, and absence. She could not speak for the months or years of labor, care, apprehension, and possible exhaustion that preceded her death. She appeared as victim, and rightly so, but also as evidence. This is an unavoidable harshness of legal process. It honors the dead by naming the wrong done to them, yet it also diminishes them by necessity, since the machinery of the court is designed not to reconstruct a life in fullness, but to establish what happened to it and who bears legal consequence. In a domestic case, that reduction can feel especially severe. Elizabeth was not just any victim. She was the mother at the center of the home whose murder had ruptured an entire structure of daily existence. Her death carried emotional meanings that exceeded the courtroom's capacity to hold them. Yet those meanings did not disappear. They lingered around the proceedings as moral force, even when not explicitly stated. The image of the slain mother shaped the atmosphere in which Blanche was judged, whether or not every participant consciously acknowledged it. It was there in the shock of the case, in the urgency of classification, and in the certainty that she could not simply be returned to village life as though nothing irrevocable had happened. This certainty is what makes the legal outcome feel so final even before sentence or verdict was fully formalized. There was no plausible path back into ordinary society. Blanche had crossed beyond the limits within which a rural daughter could be understood or tolerated. Whatever sympathy her apparent madness invited, it did not reduce the danger she represented in the eyes of the law. The purpose of the proceeding was therefore not to weigh whether she should resume life among her own people, but to determine the proper institutional mechanism by which she should be removed from them. The phrase, trial without redemption, belongs here because the courtroom offered no meaningful restoration to anyone involved. It did not restore Elizabeth's life. It did not restore the Bastable family's shattered domestic world. It did not restore the village's previous confidence in the ordinary safety of household life. And it did not restore Blanche to herself. If anything, it completed her estrangement. The woman who may once have been thought temporarily troubled, salvageable, manageable, or still somehow reclaimable was now formally recognized as beyond those hopes. Whether through verdict, finding, or certification, the law fixed what the household had learned in terror. She could not safely remain where she had been. For many Victorian observers, this may have appeared just. Not just in the sense of moral satisfaction, for cases of madness rarely produce that, but just in the administrative sense that proper order had now been reasserted. The household disaster had been lifted out of private chaos and placed under state control. The daughter who had killed her mother would not vanish into uncertainty. She would be sent where such persons were sent. The case would move from the disturbing intimacy of home into the controlled obscurity of institution. Society could then reassure itself that a boundary had been restored. But the restoration was always imperfect. The need for such a process revealed the fragility of the very domestic ideal Victorian culture preferred to celebrate. Blanche Bastable did not arrive in court from some alien or criminal underworld. She came from the center of an ordinary rural household. Her presence before the law testified not only to her own collapse, but to the failure of family, local understanding, and available care to prevent that collapse from ending in death. The trial contained the consequences. It did not solve the deeper problem from which they had arisen. By the time the legal process concluded, the next stage was already implicit. Blanche would not simply be punished in the ordinary manner. She would be transferred into a different regime, one reserved for those whose violence and insanity made them unsuitable for the common categories of prison or parish life. The house in East Orchard was now behind her. The court, cold and formal though it was, had done its work. It had taken a daughter from the ruins of her home and rendered her into a case suitable for confinement. What lay ahead was not freedom, nor any humane return. It was the institution. It was removal. And it was the long shadow of Broadmoor. Chapter 7. Broadmoor. Once the law had done with Blanche Bastable, she did not return to the world from which she had come. There was no path back to East Orchard. No quiet reintegration into rural life, no possibility that the household which had already been broken by strain and then shattered by violence might somehow receive her again. The daughter who had once existed inside the ordinary forms of family identity had been transformed, first by the act itself, and then by the judgment that followed it. She now belonged to another order of Victorian life, one less visible than the village, more heavily documented than the home, and more final in its effects than any courtroom pronouncement. She belonged to the institution. For Blanche, that institution was Broadmoor. The name carried a particular weight in 19th century England. Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum had been created for those who stood awkwardly and fearfully between recognized categories, not simply prisoners, because insanity had altered their legal status, not merely patients, because they had committed acts the law could not ignore. It was, in effect, an answer to a social problem Victorian society preferred not to contemplate too closely. What was to be done with people whose minds were judged disordered, but whose actions had made them too dangerous for ordinary care and too troubling for conventional punishment? Broadmoor was one of the state's most significant replies. To understand Blanche's fate there, it is necessary to understand what such a place represented. It was not a refuge in the soft sense later generations might wish to imagine. Nor was it simply a prison under another name. It belonged to the expanding 19th century apparatus of classification, surveillance, and containment. Its purpose was partly therapeutic according to the thinking of the time, partly custodial, and wholly shaped by the belief that certain people had become impossible to leave within ordinary society. It housed the violent, the unstable, the legally anomalous, the morally disturbing, and the medically perplexing. In that sense, Broadmoor was a place built not only to hold bodies, but to manage anxieties. Women such as Blanche Bastable occupied a peculiar position within that system. They were fewer in number than the men, but often more disturbing to the public imagination. A violent woman, especially one whose crime emerged from the family, unsettled the social order in ways that exceeded the immediate offense. She challenged prevailing assumptions about femininity, moral influence, domestic gentleness, and the natural role of women within the home. Once she entered Broadmoor, she was no longer merely a daughter, wife, or mother who had committed a dreadful act. She became part of a hidden population of women whom society could neither understand comfortably nor safely leave in view. This was one of the institution's functions: concealment. Not concealment in the crude sense of secrecy alone, though there was certainly distance and obscurity involved, but concealment through classification. Broadmoor did not simply hide disturbing women from sight. It translated them into a controlled category. It took the horror and disorder they represented and rendered them manageable within bureaucratic language. Admission, diagnosis, conduct, observation, restraint, release, or continued detention. In doing so, it converted moral unease into administrative process. The woman did not disappear entirely. She was preserved in the records, but she disappeared from ordinary life. For Blanche, this must have meant a second rupture after the first. The first rupture was the crime itself, by which she crossed irreversibly from troubled daughter to killer. The second was institutional admission, by which she crossed from legal subject to confined person. If the courtroom had formalized her separation from her former life, Broadmoor completed it. The village, the lanes, the working rhythms of Dorset, the domestic spaces in which her disturbance had unfolded, all these now stood at a distance not measured merely in miles, but in kind. She had entered an enclosed world where the state, not the household, determined the terms of her existence. That existence would have been governed by routine, observation, and restraint. Victorian institutions valued order not only because order was practical, but because it was ideological. Regularity was thought corrective. Timetables, supervision, prescribed movement, assigned spaces, and careful management of conduct were all part of the logic by which institutions sought to contain or improve those in their charge. In an asylum for criminal lunatics, that logic was sharpened by the awareness that the inmates were not merely disturbed, but associated with violence. Whatever attempts at treatment existed were inseparable from the need for security. This is important in considering Blanche's life there. To say that she was sent to Broadmoor because she was regarded as mad is true, but incomplete. She was sent there because she was regarded as mad and dangerous. The second term altered the meaning of the first. A woman in an ordinary asylum might be pitiable. A woman in Broadmoor was pitiable, perhaps, but also feared. Her presence there testified not only to illness, but to the state's judgment that her illness had already proved deadly or gravely destructive. She was therefore treated within an institutional culture shaped by caution, classification, and a profound distrust of instability. Within such a culture, the individual could become strangely flattened. The details of a life that mattered deeply within a family, habits, humor, tenderness, sorrow, memory, small acts of care, ordinary personality, had little power in an institution whose central concern was conduct. The patient became legible through behaviour. Was she calm, excitable, delusional, cooperative, dangerous, silent, violent, religiously fixated, melancholic, manageable? These were the categories through which daily institutional life sorted the people inside it. Whatever Blanche had once been in the full complexity of daughterhood was now filtered through a narrower set of observations. This narrowing is one of the quiet cruelties of confinement. It does not necessarily involve overt brutality. It can occur through the sheer weight of system. A woman may be fed, housed, supervised, and recorded, yet steadily lose the ordinary dimensions of herself in the eyes of those who control her environment. She becomes what the institution must monitor. In Blanche's case, this likely meant that the story of East Orchard, the household strain, the relation to her mother, and the moral horror of the crime remained present mainly as background to her current status. What mattered most from day to day was how she behaved now, inside the walls. But the crime would never have ceased to matter. Broadmoor was not an ordinary place of treatment. Every inmate carried into it an act or acts that had brought them under its authority. The institution may have looked forward in its daily management, but it was built upon irreversible pasts. Blanche did not arrive there as a blank case of female derangement. She arrived as the woman who had shot her mother. That fact would have shaped how she was seen, even if it receded in ordinary administrative routine. The institution held women not only because they were disordered, but because their disorder had become publicly catastrophic. For women, the emotional atmosphere of such confinement could be especially bleak. Victorian womanhood was deeply tied to relational identity. A woman was culturally understood through her place in family and household life, even when real women's lives were far more complex than that model allowed. Once institutionalized, and particularly once institutionalized after an act of violence, she was cut away from those familiar forms of recognition. She became neither proper daughter, nor wife, nor useful domestic woman. She occupied instead a suspended social state. She was alive, but outside ordinary female life. Watched, but not trusted. Named, but no longer at liberty to inhabit the identities by which she had once been known. Broadmoor was thus not merely a place of custody. It was a place of social death of a particular kind. This was not absolute. Families might visit. Names remained in records. Some inmates were eventually released. Yet the symbolic force of the institution lay in removal. It gathered into itself those who had become incompatible with the smooth public fiction of domestic order. Society did not wish to kill them outright, nor could it comfortably absorb them. So it confined them. In Blanche's case, the move to Broadmoor marked the point at which the Victorian state assumed permanent authority over a life that family, parish, and ordinary law could no longer safely contain. To imagine Broadmoor simply as grim architecture and locked doors, however, would be insufficient. It was also a community of a kind, though a coerced one. Women lived there alongside other women whose lives had likewise been broken by violence, insanity, judgment, and institutional power. This is one of the more haunting aspects of such places. They gathered together individuals whose crimes may have been very different, but whose social meaning converged. They were women who had ceased to fit the categories their culture most valued. Some had killed husbands. Some had harmed children. Some had attacked strangers. Some, like Blanche, had turned violence inward upon the structure of family itself. Together they formed a hidden history of female transgression and suffering. That hidden history matters because it shows that Blanche was not singular, even if her case was shocking. Victorian England often treated such women as aberrations, each one a dreadful exception. Yet institutions like Broadmoor revealed a quieter truth, that there existed, beneath the sentimental story a culture told about women, a substantial number of women whose lives had already broken against the limits of that story. Their presence exposed the inadequacy of simple ideals. They were not all monsters, nor all pure victims, nor all merely misunderstood patients. They were difficult, damaged, dangerous, suffering, and human in unequal measure. Broadmoor was where society placed them once their existence could no longer be denied. For Blanche, the emotional meaning of this cannot now be fully recovered. Did she understand where she was? Did she grasp the permanence of what had happened? Did she move through intervals of calm, confusion, remorse, or continuing delusion? Did she remember East Orchard with clarity, or had the inner world of her own mind become more immediate than any geography outside it? The records, where they survive, are seldom generous enough to answer such questions in full. Institutions preserve observation more readily than interiority. They record what staff saw, what doctors concluded, what procedures followed. They do not easily preserve what it felt like to be the confined person at the center of those observations. Still, some truths can be inferred. A woman sent to Broadmoor after killing her mother did not enter a world likely to restore her previous self. Whatever therapeutic ambitions the institution possessed, its dominant fact was confinement. Blanche's life would now have been structured by others, narrated by others, and judged by others. Her movement, speech, conduct, and likely prospects would all be mediated through institutional authority. The very question of who she now was would be answered less by kinship or memory than by diagnosis and record. This is where the Victorian intersection of crime and medicine becomes most visible. The institution did not erase moral condemnation simply because it employed medical language. Rather, medicine and condemnation often operated together. To call a woman insane could sound clinical, but in practice it often placed her under conditions saturated with moral judgment. The orderly versus the disorderly patient, the compliant versus the troublesome, the recoverable versus the incurable, the quiet woman versus the dangerous one. These distinctions were never purely neutral. They reflected values as much as symptoms. A woman like Blanche would have been understood not only as mentally disturbed, but as a failure of proper womanhood made institutionally legible. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, the world she had left behind continued without her. This is another cruelty of confinement seldom remarked upon directly. Villages recover, or seem to. Farms continue. Seasons turn. New routines form around old absences. The household at the center of a tragedy does not remain forever suspended in the exact hour of catastrophe, though it may feel so to those closest to it. Yet the confined person is often held in a more static relation to the past. Blanche's new life in Broadmoor would have unfolded in a space built largely for repetition and supervision, while East Orchard and all connected to it moved onward into altered forms of ordinary time. That distance deepens the tragedy of Elizabeth Bastable's death as well. The institution to which Blanche was sent could process her, categorize her, and retain her. It could not in any sense answer the question of what had been lost with Elizabeth. The mother remained absent, and the absence would have shaped the meaning of Blanche's confinement whether or not the institution acknowledged it daily. Broadmoor could contain the daughter who killed. It could not repair the domestic world from which that killing had come. In this way the institution solved the public problem while leaving the human one untouched. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth about Broadmoor's role in cases like Blanche's. It functioned as a necessary mechanism within the logic of the age. A woman who had committed matricide in a state of apparent madness could not be left at liberty. The state required somewhere to place her. Yet the very existence of that solution reveals how limited Victorian society's imagination could be once domestic order had finally collapsed. Before the crime, the household was expected to contain disturbance. After the crime, the institution was expected to contain the person. Between those two enclosures, there was very little space for understanding that did not reduce itself either to private endurance or public sequestration. Blanche Bastable's story, once inside Broadmoor, therefore becomes quieter, but not less grave. The drama of the shooting is over. The noise of the courtroom recedes. In their place comes something colder and longer. The administrative afterlife of a woman judged too dangerous for freedom and too disordered for ordinary punishment. It is here that Victorian power appears in one of its most disciplined forms. Not in the spectacle of execution, but in the steady maintenance of a person within walls built for indefinite containment. For Blanche, Broadmoor was not simply where she was sent. It was where the state completed its claim upon her. It was where the identity of daughter gave way to inmate. And it was where the rest of her life would be overshadowed by the single fatal act that had first brought her there. Chapter 8. The death of Blanche Bastable. After the violence, after the legal process, after the institutional removal, there remained the fact of continued life. This is one of the less dramatic but more haunting realities of true crime. A person may commit an act so terrible that it seems, in retrospect, to consume the whole story. Yet the act itself occupies only a moment. What follows can be years of confinement, silence, routine, illness, and gradual decline. Years in which the world no longer speaks loudly of the crime, but the life shaped by it continues all the same. For Blanche Bastable, the movement into Broadmoor did not end her story at once. It extended it into another form, one quieter than the gunshot that had made her notorious, but no less tragic for that quietness. By the time she entered the institution, the essential structures of her former life had already been destroyed. Her mother was dead by her hand. Her household was broken. Her place within the ordinary world of Dorset village life was gone. The law had not restored her, but delivered her into confinement. From then onward, whatever remained of Blanche Bastable's existence unfolded under conditions largely determined by others. She no longer lived by the seasonal pattern of rural labor, nor by the intimate and difficult routines of family life. She lived by institutional time, measured, repetitive, supervised, and removed from the rhythms that had once given shape to ordinary days. The emotional meaning of such a transition is not easily preserved in the historical record. Institutions document outcomes far more carefully than inward experience. They note admissions, symptoms, conduct, transfers, deterioration, and death. What they capture less readily is what it meant for the confined woman herself to continue living after the act that had severed her from her past. A person in such circumstances may live in memory, confusion, remorse, delusion, numbness, or some unstable mixture of these states. She may not possess a coherent narrative of her own life at all. The records, however, proceed as though coherence belonged to the institution rather than the individual. The woman is observed. The woman is classified. The woman declines. The woman dies. This is one of the bleakest forms of historical compression. Blanche's life after admission to Broadmoor would almost certainly have been shaped by the same institutional principles that governed the rest of the asylum: order, surveillance, categorization, and management. Whatever treatment or care existed would have been inseparable from the fact that she was there because she had killed. Even if her daily conduct became quiet, even if she no longer presented the same visible danger, the institution would still understand her through the crime that had justified her confinement. The act did not need to be repeated in order to remain present. It lingered in the background of her status, informing every assumption the institution made about her. And yet life inside such walls was not static in the emotional sense. Time in confinement changes its pressure, but not its weight. For some, the first months may bring agitation, resistance, or bewilderment. For others, there is collapse into passivity. Some move between lucidity and disturbance. Others settle into institutional habits that look like acceptance from outside but may in fact be little more than endurance. The absence of direct testimony from Blanche does not allow certainty about how she inhabited those years. But the very structure of Broadmoor suggests a life narrowed in possibility, stripped of ordinary agency, and governed by a system that held the future open only in the most conditional and limited way. This narrowing matters because it reshapes the meaning of survival. To remain alive after such a crime is not necessarily to remain within life as it had previously been understood. The daughter who had once existed in relation to home, family, and parish now existed in relation to confinement. Her days would have been marked less by work freely undertaken than by tasks assigned or routines imposed. Her relationships, if any remained active, were mediated through distance, permission, and institutional rules. Her identity, once however troubled, still personal and familial, had become medical, legal, and administrative. She survived, but under a definition of life the state found manageable. In that sense, Blanche's decline cannot be separated from her confinement. A woman whose mental state had already proved severely disturbed, who had been torn from every ordinary social structure, and who now lived under continuous institutional control was hardly placed in circumstances likely to foster renewal in any full human sense. Even where the asylum aimed at cure or management, it remained a place built around the aftermath of catastrophe. For some, it may have offered safety from worse chaos. For others, it marked the beginning of another kind of wasting, quieter, less visible, but profound. The body persists. The person is reduced. Blanche died young. This fact carries a gravity beyond its biographical neatness. To die young in confinement, after killing one's mother and being absorbed into the machinery of the criminal asylum, is to have one's life resolved not through reconciliation or recovery, but through truncation. Whatever she might once have become in another world, or under different conditions, is irrelevant to the official ending. The institution records death as event. History records it as closure. But moral and emotional closure is another matter entirely. Her death does not settle the meaning of the case. It deepens its sadness. There is a temptation in historical crime writing to treat such deaths as fittingly grim conclusions, as though the logic of tragedy has been cleanly completed. But real endings are rarely so satisfying. Blanche's death in or in association with Broadmoor did not redeem her. It did not answer what, exactly, had passed through her mind before the shooting. It did not restore Elizabeth Bastable's life or heal the family rupture caused by her death. It did not allow the village to forget. It did not produce wisdom sufficient to explain why the Bastable household had moved from strain to horror. It merely ended Blanche's own bodily presence in the world. The unanswered questions remained. This is why her death feels less like conclusion than extinguishment. The institution had already performed the work of social disappearance. Death performed the rest. Whatever future she had once possessed as a daughter in rural Dorset had long been consumed by the crime and its consequences. The remaining years, however they were lived, unfolded within a horizon already narrowed almost to nothing. Her death then appears not as a dramatic final act but as the last stage of an existing diminishment. The woman who had already been removed from ordinary life was now removed from life altogether. And yet it would be too simple to write her only as a vanished madwoman. Blanche Bastable's death must be held alongside the fuller moral complexity of her story. She was the killer of her mother. She was also, by every indication, a deeply disturbed woman living in an age whose understanding of mental collapse was partial, moralist, and often fearful. She was dangerous. She may also have been frightened, unreachable, and unwell beyond the ability of those around her to manage. To note her death in Broadmoor is not to excuse the matricide. It is to acknowledge that the person who committed it did not emerge from the case as triumphant, monstrous in any theatrical sense, or culturally empowered by notoriety. She emerged diminished, confined, and dead before old age. That trajectory distinguishes her sharply from the more sensational criminals who dominate popular memory. Blanche's story is not one of calculated career violence, repeated manipulation, or flamboyant notoriety. It is not a tale of the murderer who relished public fame, outwitted authorities, or turned crime into legend. It is a darker and sadder pattern. Domestic breakdown, fatal violence, legal absorption, institutional confinement, and early death. The effect is less sensational than desolate. Her life narrows rather than expands under scrutiny. The closer one looks, the less spectacle remains and the more human ruin appears. It is in that ruin that the true significance of her death lies. By the time Blanche died, Victorian England had done what it knew how to do with women like her. It had interpreted her behaviour through the available language of madness. It had acknowledged the crime without processing her through the ordinary forms of punishment. It had confined her in a place designed for those whose violence and insanity could not be comfortably separated. And there, beyond the domestic world from which she had come, it had kept her until death overtook whatever remained of her future. The system had worked, in its own terms. But the cost of that working remained written across every part of the case. There is something peculiarly lonely about such endings. Executions at least create public finality. Prison sentences, where finite, contain the theoretical possibility of release. But death in institutional confinement after a crime judged inseparable from madness belongs to a colder moral landscape. The public fear that once surrounded the offender fades. The household where the tragedy began has already been left behind. The confined person dies in the shadow of a story that has ceased to be current but has not ceased to define them. If remembered at all, they are remembered through the crime. Their death enters the record as one more administrative fact. Blanche's death thus completes, in one sense, the transition from daughter to case. In East Orchard, she had once existed within the practical, emotional, and social fabric of ordinary life. After the shooting, she entered the machinery of law. After the law came the institution. After the institution came the record of decline and death. At each stage, she became more legible to systems and less present as an ordinary human being. This is not unusual in 19th-century histories of women who entered the archive through scandal, madness, or crime. Their individuality survives in fragments, while the structures that controlled them speak at length. And still, what remains is enough to trouble. The image of Blanche Bastable dying young after the murder of her mother is difficult to set aside because it denies almost every form of emotional resolution readers are trained to expect. There is no triumphant unmasking, no elegant punishment, no moral reform, no restored order worth celebrating. There is only a chain of loss. The loss of mental stability, the loss of domestic peace, the loss of Elizabeth Bastable's life, the loss of Blanche's freedom, and finally the loss of Blanche herself. The case offers not catharsis, but accumulation. This accumulation is what gives her story its enduring force. One domestic crime in a Dorset parish becomes, when examined closely, a study in how a society managed the unbearable. It feared female violence, and so named it madness. It feared madness joined to violence, and so confined it. It feared what such cases implied about the fragility of family life, and so hid them behind walls and records. Blanche's death did not interrupt that pattern. It completed it. Once she died, the state no longer had to decide what to do with her. The problem had been resolved by time, illness, and mortality. But history remains with the unresolved human questions. What had she been before the unraveling? What did Elizabeth Bastable endure before the final act? What did the household know? And when did fear overtake hope? What did confinement feel like to a woman who had already become a stranger to herself? These questions do not disappear because a death certificate, register, or institutional note declares an ending. If anything, death intensifies them by ensuring they can never now be answered fully. So the chapter closes not with judgment neatly delivered, but with quiet. Blanche Bastable died far from the ordinary village life in which her story began. She died not as daughter, nor as recoverable patient, nor as publicly remembered criminal of the sensational kind, but as one more confined woman whose life had narrowed under the combined weight of mental collapse, violence, and Victorian control. The gunshot that once shattered a home had long since faded. In its place remained the slower silence of institution and grave. That silence is not innocence. It is not absolution. It is only the last stillness in a story already shaped by too many kinds of loss. Chapter 9. The mother at the center of the story. In crimes of this kind, the dead are often the first to disappear. The statement seems contradictory, but it is one of the most persistent distortions in true crime history. The victim's death is the reason the case exists in public memory at all. Yet once the machinery of narrative begins to turn, attention shifts almost irresistibly towards the person who caused that death. The killer is examined, interpreted, diagnosed, condemned, explained. The victim, meanwhile, is fixed in a single role and left there. The wife, the child, the mother, the body, the deceased. The fuller human life that preceded the fatal act is compressed into a relation to someone else's violence. So it is with Elizabeth Bastable. She survives in the story chiefly because Blanche killed her. That fact is unavoidable, but it is not sufficient. Before she became the murdered mother in a Dorset tragedy, Elizabeth Bastable was a woman of the rural 19th century, living within the constant demands of household labor, marriage, family management, and village respectability. She had a life before the gunshot. She had work before the crime. She had a place in the structure of the home that cannot be reduced to the moment in which it was shattered. To understand the full moral force of the case, she must be returned to the center of it. This return is not sentimental correction. It is historical necessity. Domestic murder is never only about the person who kills. It is also about the life that is interrupted, the labor that vanishes, the relationship severed, and the ordinary continuity of a household broken beyond repair. In family crimes especially, the victim's role in sustaining daily life is often so familiar to contemporaries that it goes unrecorded. A mother's work was expected. Her care was expected. Her emotional and practical endurance were expected. Because they were expected, they were rarely described in detail unless they failed. When such a woman is killed, the scale of what has been lost can be obscured precisely because so much of what she did had previously been taken for granted. Elizabeth Bastable almost certainly lived within that condition of necessary invisibility. As the wife of a dairy farmer in rural Dorset, she belonged to a world in which work did not announce itself with grandeur. It repeated. It accumulated. It formed the background against which the household remained viable. The tasks of such a woman were not occasional but constant. Preparing food, managing stores, washing and mending clothing, cleaning rooms, overseeing domestic order, tending to the needs of family members, and carrying that large and largely unrecorded burden of emotional steadiness expected of mothers and wives. If there were servants or help, their presence did not erase her role. If there were daughters, their labor often supplemented rather than replaced hers. The mother remained at the center of domestic continuity. In a farming family, this continuity mattered in practical ways as well as moral ones. Agricultural life could not function on sentiment alone. The household was part of the working economy. Meals had to appear at the right times. Clothing had to be kept serviceable. The domestic environment had to support the broader rhythm of labor beyond the house. Disorder at home carried consequences outside it. A mother in such a setting was not simply the guardian of feeling, as Victorian ideology liked to suggest, but the manager of innumerable details upon which family survival depended. She worked in forms so habitual that they could be ignored until they ceased. This is one of the reasons the murder of a mother in her own home carries such peculiar weight. It is not only the killing of a person, but the destruction of a domestic center. A mother's death in a rural household was not easily absorbable. It meant the loss of labor, memory, order, care, and authority all at once. Her absence moved through every room. It appeared not only in grief, but in practical dislocation. What she had done must now be done by others, imperfectly or not at all. What she had held together might begin to loosen. In this sense, Elizabeth's death was not only emotionally devastating, it was structurally devastating. The household lost one of its principal supports the moment she fell. And yet the language of the case does not naturally dwell there. It turns instead towards Blanche. Her instability, her mania, her violence, her trial, her confinement, her death. All these things matter, but they can eclipse the mother so thoroughly that Elizabeth becomes little more than the figure Blanche acted upon. To reverse that imbalance requires attention to what it meant to be a woman like Elizabeth in a place like East Orchard. She was not an abstract maternal symbol. She was a working woman in a rural society that depended heavily upon women's daily effort while often recording that effort only in the most fragmentary terms. The Victorian ideal of motherhood complicates this further. The period spoke reverently of mothers, but often in language that obscured the conditions under which they lived. The mother was praised as moral guide, emotional anchor, quiet guardian of the hearth. These phrases conveyed respect, but they also idealized and simplified. They did not capture tiredness, worry, repetitive labor, strained tempers, fear for a troubled child, or the exhausting work of trying to preserve calm in a household under pressure. The ideal mother of Victorian rhetoric was serene. The real mother of a difficult household often had no such luxury. Elizabeth, if the shape of the case tells anything clearly, must have been carrying more than ordinary domestic burdens in the period before her death. To live with Blanche's deterioration would almost certainly have required not merely routine management, but sustained vigilance. If Blanche had become unstable, religiously fixated, emotionally erratic, or frightening, then Elizabeth was likely one of the first to feel the full burden of that change. Mothers often are. They stand nearest to domestic disturbance because they are nearest to domestic life itself. A mother is the one who sees the morning mood, the altered appetite, the strange speech, the restless movement, the failed calm, the emotional aftermath of each episode. She is also often the one expected to absorb it all with patience. Such patience can become a form of peril. A mother in Elizabeth's position may continue to approach where others withdraw. She may still attempt to soothe, to reason, to correct, to help, to hope. She may put herself repeatedly in the path of someone whose suffering has become dangerous because she cannot easily cease to be mother, even when the daughter before her has become difficult to reach through ordinary love or authority. This is one of the terrible truths domestic crime reveals. The role that makes a person most necessary can also make them most vulnerable. If Blanche had indeed entered a state of mind no longer governable by usual family structures, Elizabeth's closeness to her would have been both emotional and physical. She would have been the one most exposed to the daily reality of that condition. Not exposed in a dramatic, theatrical sense, but in the slow and grinding way private life exposes those who keep households running. The mother cannot simply disappear when trouble enters the home. She must continue to be present. She continues to share rooms, tasks, meals, and silences. She continues to negotiate ordinary life even as ordinary life becomes strained nearly beyond recognition. In that repeated presence, danger grows not as an abstract threat, but as part of routine. To place Elizabeth back at the center of the story, then, is to acknowledge that she was not a passive symbol awaiting martyrdom. She was living through something before she died. She may have been frightened. She may have been exhausted. She may have alternated between pity and frustration, hope and dread. She may have tried to defend Blanche from the judgment of others even while fearing what Blanche was becoming. The records do not yield her private thoughts in any full way, but the shape of rural domestic life allows one truth to stand clearly enough. Elizabeth's death came at the end of a period in which she was likely carrying an immense weight of unrecorded maternal labor. This labor deserves to be named because it is so easily erased by the later fascination of the crime. True crime writing can, if careless, repeat the injustice of the archive by turning the mother into scenery for the daughter's collapse. But Elizabeth Bastable was not scenery. She was one of the principal realities of the household. The home would have borne her mark in 100 repetitive acts no official would think to preserve. The neatness or disorder of rooms, the management of food, the maintenance of clothing, the rhythms of family life, the social respectability of the house, the moral texture of everyday interaction. All these were likely shaped in part by her work. To lose her by violence was to lose not only a beloved person, but the lived architecture of the household itself. The maternal relation in Victorian culture was also heavily moralist, which deepened the horror of the case. A mother was imagined not just as caretaker but as the emotional and ethical source from which daughterly conduct should naturally flow. In that idealized framework, a daughter killing her mother appeared not only criminal, but almost sacrilegious. It overturned the hierarchy by which domestic life was supposed to sustain itself. Yet the intensity of this symbolic horror can obscure the particular woman at its center. Elizabeth becomes the mother, in a cultural drama rather than Elizabeth Bastable, wife, worker, parish woman, and living participant in the family's ordeal. This chapter must resist that abstraction. To say that she was a mother is true. To stop there is insufficient. She was a woman who inhabited the ordinary burdens of class, place, and period. Rural Dorset in the 19th century was not a gentle pastoral dream, whatever later nostalgia might pretend. It was labor-intensive, socially watchful, economically vulnerable, and often demanding upon women's strength. A mother in such a world did not merely nurture. She organized. She endured. She held together what could be held together. This is the life Blanche's act destroyed. It is also worth considering how little room women such as Elizabeth had for their own distress. Victorian domestic ideology granted mothers moral importance, but not necessarily emotional relief. A woman could be praised for patience without being given help. She could be expected to manage the emotional instability of others while suppressing her own fear. In a household where a daughter's mental state was worsening, Elizabeth may have had few outlets beyond prayer, private endurance, or whatever limited counsel could be found in family or parish life. Her exhaustion, if it existed, would likely not have been treated as a central problem in its own right. The mother was expected to cope until coping failed. When it failed, the consequences were fatal. But even here, the language of failure must be used carefully. Elizabeth did not fail in the moral sense by being unable to prevent her own death. Rather, the structures around her failed to protect her. The family could not contain Blanche safely. The broader understanding of mental illness available to the period could not guarantee meaningful intervention before catastrophe. The household ideal itself offered no shield against violence when one of its members had become profoundly unwell. Elizabeth's death exposes these failures with devastating clarity. It shows how much 19th century society asked of mothers, and how little protection those demands sometimes gave them. After her death, her role in the story changed immediately. She became the victim. Legally, that was correct. Socially, it was inevitable. But there is a difference between the fact of victimhood and the fullness of personhood. Victimhood explains what was done to her. It does not capture who she had been before that moment. The danger in historical writing is that the convenience of the first will swallow the complexity of the second. This chapter stands, therefore, as a correction not of fact but of emphasis. Elizabeth Bastable must not be permitted to vanish into the grammar of the case. What remains of her now is fragmentary, as is so often true of women whose lives were not publicly documented until tragedy intervened. There may be names in records, traces in parish structures, indications of family relation, perhaps the occasional genealogical fact. But the deeper realities of her life, The tone of her speech, the pattern of her days, the way she moved through her own rooms, the private shape of her affection or weariness, are gone. This absence should be met with restraint, not invention. Yet restraint does not require indifference. It is possible to acknowledge the gaps and still insist upon the significance of what those gaps surround. A woman whose life was lived largely in the unrecorded center of family labor and whose death violently propelled her into history. There is a somber irony in this. Elizabeth Bastable is remembered because she was killed, whereas the countless daily acts by which she sustained life are barely visible at all. Violence produces record. Care often does not. The murder enters history in sharp outline. The years of work that preceded it dissolve. This imbalance is not unique to her case, but her case makes it stark. To restore her, even partially, is to push against a broader historical habit of letting women's ordinary labor disappear unless scandal drags it into view. The tragedy of Blanche Bastable's story therefore cannot be measured solely by Blanche's decline or punishment. It must also be measured by what happened to Elizabeth, by the extinguishing of a life that had likely been central to the household in every practical and emotional sense, by the loss suffered by all who depended upon her, and by the cruel narrowing through which she survives chiefly as the mother who is killed. The human truth is larger. She was the mother at the center of the story long before she became its victim. And she remains at its center still, if the story is told honestly. Without Elizabeth, there is no full understanding of what the Bastable crime destroyed. Without her, the case risks becoming only a study of female madness and violence, when it is equally a study of maternal labor, domestic vulnerability, and the terrible fragility of home. Her death is not merely the event that advances Blanche's narrative. It is the wound that ought to shape the moral structure of the whole book. For this reason, the story must pause here and look steadily at her absence. The daughter lived on for a time in confinement, still generating interpretation, fear, and tragic curiosity. The mother did not. Her part in the world ended in the house she had helped maintain. The routines she had sustained had to continue without her. The family she had served had to absorb the loss without any adequate language for such a violation. The village had to remember her death through the scandal of the act, even while the fuller meaning of her life remained largely private and unrecorded. This is the hard imbalance with which the chapter closes. Blanche Bastable became a case because she killed. Elizabeth Bastable became a shadow because she was killed. To write the history properly is to refuse that shadow. It is to remember that at the center of the gunshot, the trial, the asylum, and every later retelling stood a mother whose life had substance long before her death gave others a story to tell. Chapter 10. What Victorian England Did with Difficult Women. Blanche Bastable's story belongs to one household, one parish, one mother, one daughter, and one act of irreversible violence. But it does not remain there. No historical crime of this kind can be understood fully if it is treated only as an isolated tragedy. The details are specific, the grief particular, the losses intimate and real. Yet the meanings attached to the case were shaped by a much larger world. A world with established ideas about womanhood, obedience, family order, moral influence, religion, madness, and social control. Blanche did not enter history as a person stripped of context. She entered it as a Victorian woman, and Victorian womanhood came with rules so deeply embedded they were often mistaken for nature itself. That is the wider structure in which her life and death must be read. The 19th century liked to imagine women in sharply contrasting forms. There was the good woman and the fallen woman, the calm mother and the hysterical girl, the dutiful daughter and the unnatural creature, the respectable wife and the dangerous female, the gentle invalid and the deranged lunatic. These categories were never as stable in real life as public language suggested, but they were socially powerful all the same. They allowed behavior to be judged quickly and deviation to be named with confidence. Women who remained within the boundaries of approved conduct could be idealized, though often at the cost of being simplified. Women who crossed those boundaries could be pathologized, feared, mocked, or removed. Blanche Bastable crossed them in the most terrifying way possible. She did not simply become emotional, troublesome, or morally inconvenient. She became violent within the home and turned that violence upon her mother. Yet long before the fatal shot was fired, the terms in which she would eventually be interpreted were already available to the culture around her. The unstable woman, the over-religious woman, the woman who could not regulate herself, the woman whose conduct made others uneasy. All these figures were legible to Victorian society. They were not understood with kindness or accuracy in every case, but they were recognizable. By the time Blanche reached the stage of outright catastrophe, her world already possessed a vocabulary for treating her as a problem. That vocabulary did more than describe. It governed response. This is one of the central truths of 19th century social history. People do not respond to behavior in a vacuum. They respond through the moral and cultural ideas their society makes available. A woman in distress could therefore be interpreted through overlapping systems of thought: religion, family authority, medicine, law, class expectation, and local reputation. None of these systems stood entirely apart from the others. A daughter who became increasingly disturbed might be seen as sinful, ill, weak, unruly, overexcited, morally compromised, spiritually afflicted, or mentally deranged, depending on circumstance and observer. Often she would be seen as several of these things at once. This made the category of the difficult woman extraordinarily elastic. A woman did not need to commit murder to enter it. She could become difficult by speaking too much, feeling too intensely, resisting domestic expectations, refusing submission, showing sexual independence, displaying religious enthusiasm beyond what others found comfortable, becoming melancholic, becoming angry, or simply proving impossible to manage within the family structure assigned to her. Some difficult women were merely inconvenient. Others were judged deviant. Some were pitted. Some were punished. Some were treated. Some were hidden. A few, like Blanche, became impossible to ignore because their difficulty ended in violence. But the underlying question remained the same. What was society to do with women who did not remain governable within the accepted terms of femininity? Victorian England had several answers. The first was discipline within the home. This was the most ordinary and least formally recorded of all responses. Families were expected to govern their own women. Fathers exercised authority. Mothers corrected behavior. Brothers, husbands, ministers, neighbors, and local communities all formed part of a diffuse structure of supervision. The daughter was expected to yield to that structure as a matter of moral duty. If she became difficult, the first remedy was not institutional or legal. It was domestic. Advice, rebuke, prayer, watchfulness, emotional pressure, family management, and the demand that she return to the accepted shape of conduct. So long as this seemed possible, the family remained the primary mechanism of control. This expectation placed immense weight upon households. A family like the Bastables was not merely a site of love and labor. It was also an instrument through which social order was supposed to reproduce itself. The home was where daughters learned obedience, piety, restraint, and usefulness. If a daughter moved beyond those bounds, the family was expected to correct her before matters went any further. When this failed, the failure was not experienced only as personal sorrow. It was also social embarrassment, moral alarm, and practical crisis. The difficult woman exposed not just her own instability, but the weakness of the household's ability to contain her. If domestic management failed, the second answer was social judgment. Villages, parishes, and neighborhoods watched closely. Reputation mattered. A woman who deviated from expected behavior rarely remained legible only to her kin. Others noticed changes in speech, conduct, dress, mood, or spiritual intensity. Such women became subjects of comment. Concern and gossip often traveled together. A community might extend sympathy, but sympathy was conditional. Once behavior became troubling enough to disrupt ordinary expectations, public patience could shrink quickly. The woman was then not only difficult at home, but known as difficult beyond it. This widened the pressure upon the family and narrowed the woman's social room to move. Still, neither domestic discipline nor village judgment solved the problem of serious mental disturbance. When behavior crossed into forms that could no longer be explained as mere temper, grief, stubbornness, or impropriety, Victorian society increasingly turned to the language of medicine. But medicine did not arrive as a neutral liberating force. It arrived carrying its own assumptions. A woman might now be called insane rather than simply wicked, but the practical consequences of that shift were mixed. To be medicalized was not necessarily to be understood. It was to be placed within another framework of authority, one that could sound humane while remaining profoundly controlling. The 19th century expanded its institutions for precisely this reason. Asylums grew because families, parishes, and courts needed somewhere to put those who could no longer be safely or comfortably held within ordinary life. This did not mean every woman sent there was a victim of pure social oppression, nor that genuine mental illness was absent. Rather, it means that institutionalization operated at the meeting point of real suffering and social intolerance. Some women were undoubtedly in need of care. Some were dangerous. Some were exhausted, traumatized, or profoundly unwell. Some were simply not governable in the ways their society demanded. The asylum system often gathered these different realities together under the same broad logic of removal. For difficult women, removal was often the true point. A woman too disruptive for home, too embarrassing for family, too unstable for village life, or too frightening after violence could be passed from the intimate world of kinship into the impersonal world of institutional control. Once there, she might be described as a patient, but she was also a problem solved administratively. She no longer interrupted the household because she no longer remained in it. She no longer disturbed local social order because she had been placed elsewhere. Whatever therapeutic language surrounded her confinement, the social function of that confinement remained unmistakable. She had been extracted from ordinary life. Blanche Bastable's path follows this pattern with unusual clarity. First, there was the family's apparent effort to endure and manage what was becoming increasingly dangerous. Then there was the widening recognition that her conduct could not be comfortably contained. Then came the crime, which made continued domestic management unthinkable. After that came the law's intervention and, finally, Broadmoor. Each stage reflects a Victorian answer to the difficult woman, escalating as the previous answer failed. Home could not hold her. Community could not absorb her. Ordinary criminal punishment could not fully account for her. So the state confined her as a criminal lunatic. That phrase reveals more than it first appears to. A criminal lunatic was neither simply criminal nor simply mad. The category existed because Victorian society could not relinquish either half of the problem. The woman had done something terrible, and that terribleness had to be acknowledged. But she had also done it in a condition of mind judged disordered enough to unsettle ordinary moral accountability. The result was a hybrid status, condemned without the clean logic of ordinary guilt, pitted without the dignity of simple patienthood. She became an object of fear and management rather than a person capable of moving again through ordinary social life. Women in that category tell us something uncomfortable about Victorian ideals. If femininity had truly been natural in the way the age liked to claim, then so many systems for disciplining, correcting, medicalizing, and confining women would not have been necessary. The sheer amount of effort Victorian England devoted to shaping female conduct suggests how precarious the ideal actually was. The good woman had to be taught, supervised, rewarded, defended, and contrasted constantly against the bad one. The boundaries of acceptable womanhood were maintained through repetition and threat. Difficult women exposed this fragility by showing how much social labor was required to produce what culture preferred to call natural virtue. Blanche's case also reveals the special anxiety attached to women and violence. Male violence could be condemned while still feeling socially intelligible. Female violence, particularly when directed at children, husbands, or mothers, seemed to exceed the script. It made people reach for stronger explanatory language because it appeared to violate not only law but sex. A woman who killed challenged cherished beliefs about women as morally soft, innately nurturing, and domestically civilizing. If she killed within the home, the challenge was greater still. She seemed to turn the very sphere assigned to her into a place of threat. In that sense, the violent, difficult woman was not merely an offender. She was a symbolic crisis. Victorian England responded to that crisis by making her exceptional. This is important. The difficult woman who became violent could be treated as a warning, but only if her case was also kept at a safe conceptual distance. She must be mad, unnatural, overexcited, morally fallen, or otherwise different enough that respectable society did not have to recognize itself too clearly in her. This is part of what the label of insanity accomplished. It acknowledged danger while also quarantining it. The woman's violence became something caused by abnormality rather than by the deeper tensions, contradictions, and pressures present in ordinary domestic life. Society could then pity or fear her without asking too many questions about the structures that produced her distress. But Blanche Bastable's story resists that comforting simplification. She was not an outsider who invaded the home from some alien moral world. She was formed within the same domestic structure Victorian culture prized. She was a daughter of a farming family, living in the ordinary conditions of parish, labor, religion, and household expectation. Whatever precisely happened in her mind, it happened within those conditions, not outside them. Her crime therefore exposes not just individual collapse, but the insufficiency of the domestic ideal itself as a safeguard against suffering and danger. This is one reason difficult women occupied such an uneasy place in the 19th century. They revealed the gap between ideology and life. The age could praise the home as a moral sanctuary, but homes contained fear, resentment, coercion, exhaustion, and illness, as well as love and duty. It could praise women as natural sources of calm, but women were also vulnerable to breakdown, fury, despair, and forms of suffering that no amount of moral language could domesticate. It could treat institutionalization as humane care, but institutions also functioned as places where disturbing women were kept away from the social eye. Difficult women made visible the labor required to preserve illusions. And still, not all difficult women met Blanche's fate. That distinction matters. To broaden the argument of her case is not to erase her singularity. Most troubled daughters did not kill their mothers. Most women described as hysterical, unstable, or overexcited were not sent to Broadmoor. Most households under strain did not end in gun violence. But exceptional cases often illuminate general structures better than ordinary ones. Because Blanche's story proceeded to such an extreme conclusion, it reveals with greater clarity the steps by which Victorian England understood and managed female difficulty at every prior stage. It reveals, too, the limits of sympathy in the period. Victorian society could be compassionate, but its compassion was often conditional upon compliance. A quiet sufferer could be pitied. A pious invalid could be cared for. A melancholic woman who remained harmless might evoke tenderness. But sympathy narrowed rapidly when a woman became disruptive, resistant, frightening, or violent. At that point, concern gave way to control. This was especially so when others feared for safety or respectability. The difficult woman was tolerable only for as long as she remained governable. Once she ceased to be governable, other priorities took precedence. Those priorities were order, reputation, and protection of the social body. The household had to be shielded. The village had to be reassured. The law had to classify. The institution had to contain. Blanche's story passed through all these priorities in turn. Each one offered a different answer to her existence. None restored her. None restored her mother. None restored the Bastable household. But altogether they described the machinery through which Victorian England dealt with women it could not safely absorb. This machinery was not always cruel in intention. Some families undoubtedly acted from love. Some doctors believed sincerely in treatment. Some asylum staff tried to maintain humane conditions according to the standards of their time. Some legal actors saw the distinction between madness and vice as morally important. Yet systems must be judged not only by intention but by effect. The effect, in Blanche's case, was a movement from troubled daughter to feared woman to confined inmate to early death. However understandable each step may have seemed to contemporaries, the path as a whole remains devastating. And that devastation extends beyond one life. What Victorian England did with difficult women tells us something about what it feared most deeply. It feared women who could not be read reliably through the script of domestic usefulness. It feared women whose inner lives escaped ordinary control. It feared the possibility that the home might not reform such women, and might in fact become the place where their suffering sharpened. It feared women whose conduct blurred the line between illness and threat. Above all, it feared what such women suggested, that social order was more fragile than it appeared, and that femininity itself was less natural, less secure, and less self-policing than the age preferred to believe. Blanche Bastable became one of the women upon whom those fears were written. She is remembered because the fears attached to her ended in an act too dreadful to ignore. Yet even without the murder, her story would still belong to the wider history of how difficult women were watched, explained, and controlled. The gunshot only made visible a process already underway. It forced into the open the reality that the age had many methods for dealing with female trouble, but very few for understanding it without fear. That may be the hardest conclusion the case offers. Victorian England did not lack categories for women like Blanche. It had plenty of them. What it lacked was a way of holding together, without immediate simplification, the facts of suffering, danger, gendered expectation, domestic pressure, and human ambiguity. It divided too quickly between sinner and patient, between proper woman and deviant woman, between household member and inmate. These divisions made action possible. They did not always make truth easier to reach. In the end, what it did with difficult women was what it so often did with all difficult realities. It moralized them. It medicalized them. It confined them. And then, as far as possible, it looked away. Final chapter. The silence that remains. At the end of a case such as this, there is a temptation to search for a final explanation that will settle everything which came before. It is a familiar desire. If the violence was terrible enough, if the victim was close enough, if the domestic world destroyed by it was ordinary enough, then surely there must be some last sentence capable of arranging the facts into moral order. The daughter was mad. The mother was innocent. The family was overwhelmed. The society was unequipped. The institution was inevitable. The ending was tragic. Each of these statements contains some truth. None is large enough to contain the whole of Blanche Bastable's story. The difficulty is not that too little can be said. The difficulty is that too much of importance remains true at once. Blanche Bastable was a daughter in a rural Dorset household, shaped by the ordinary disciplines of 19th-century family life. She was also, by all surviving indications, a woman whose mind had become deeply disturbed. Elizabeth Bastable was a mother at the center of domestic labor, likely carrying the unrecorded burden of sustaining order within a household under strain. She was also the victim of a violent death at her daughter's hands. The home in East Orchard was both an ordinary working household and the setting for a breakdown that neither family, parish, nor period understanding appears to have successfully contained. Broadmoor was both a place of institutional care, according to the logic of its time, and a mechanism by which disturbing women were removed from ordinary life. These truths do not cancel one another. They accumulate. It is that accumulation that gives the case its force. There are crimes more famous than the Bastable case, crimes better preserved in newspaper sensation, court reporting, and public imagination. There are poisoners more theatrical, murderers more calculating, women whose names have endured because history found them useful to repeat. Blanche Bastable has not survived in that way. She belongs instead to a darker and quieter category of true crime. The domestic tragedy half forgotten by the broader culture, yet never fully emptied of meaning. Such cases often linger precisely because they resist spectacle. They remain disturbing after the details grow faint because what they expose is too close to ordinary life to be entirely dismissed. The ordinary is what gives the story its particular weight. A daughter, a mother, a farmhouse world, a village, labor, religion, strain. These are not the ingredients of melodrama by themselves. They are the ingredients of everyday 19th century life. The horror lies in the fact that nothing in the setting appeared dramatic enough, from the outside, to predict what would happen. This is one of the central lessons of domestic crime. Catastrophe does not always announce itself with grandeur. It often emerges from households that continue to look recognizable while danger gathers inside them. The lane remains quiet. Work is done. Doors open and close. Meals are prepared. The structure of ordinary time holds until it does not. In that sense, the case of Blanche Bastable is not only the story of an individual woman's collapse. It is the story of how fragile the ideal of home could be, even in an age that praised home with particular intensity. Victorian culture placed enormous confidence in the household. It imagined domestic life as morally shaping, emotionally civilizing, and socially stabilizing. The home was treated as a site in which the roughness of the wider world might be softened through female influence, habitual discipline, and shared order. Yet the Bastable case reveals a far less comfortable truth, that the home could also become the place where distress sharpened, where suffering lost all proportion, and where the very intimacy meant to protect people made them more vulnerable to one another. This is not a uniquely Victorian truth, though it took on distinct Victorian forms. Families have always contained contradiction. Love and resentment coexist. Care and exhaustion coexist. Duty and fear coexist. What the 19th century added was a particularly rigid framework for interpreting these tensions, especially where women were concerned. Daughters were expected to be governable. Mothers were expected to be sustaining. Disturbance in either role unsettled more than private feeling. It threatened the whole structure of moral expectation. Blanche's crime therefore resonated not merely because it was violent, but because it made visible the failure of one of the age's most cherished social ideals. The age answered that failure in the ways available to it. First came domestic management, the family's likely attempt to absorb and contain what was becoming unbearable. Then came public recognition, once the violence made private suffering impossible to conceal. Then legal classification. Then institutional removal. Each stage represented a form of response. None repaired what had been broken. None returned Elizabeth Bastable to life. None restored Blanche to an ordinary social identity. Yet each stage reveals something about the logic of the time. Victorian England preferred to believe that trouble could first be governed at home, then explained through moral or medical categories, and finally neutralized through confinement if all else failed. There is a starkness in that sequence that deserves to be faced without embellishment. What happened to Blanche Bastable after she killed her mother was, in one sense, entirely consistent with the systems of her era. She was not hanged in the ordinary way because her apparent madness complicated the question of guilt. She was not released because the violence she had committed made liberty unthinkable. She was confined because confinement was the mechanism by which the state dealt with those whose crimes and mental conditions appeared inseparable. This was a logical process within Victorian terms. It was also a deeply sad one. Logic and sadness are not opposites in history. Very often they are found side by side. The same may be said of the language used to describe women such as Blanche. Words like mania, derangement, hysteria, religious excitement, instability, insanity. These offered contemporaries ways to speak about conduct they feared and only partly understood. Some of those words may have captured real dimensions of mental illness. Some undoubtedly reflected cultural unease as much as clinical reality. Most did both. The difficult woman in the 19th century was seldom permitted to remain simply a person in pain. She became a figure upon whom society wrote its anxieties about obedience, religion, self-control, femininity, and danger. Blanche Bastable was one such figure. But she was also more than a figure. She was a human being whose mind, by all apparent evidence, had moved beyond the secure grasp of those around her before she committed an act that would define her forever. To acknowledge that fact is not to excuse her. It is to refuse the easier narrative in which she becomes either melodramatic villain or passive victim of her times. She was neither of those things in any complete sense. She was responsible for a terrible act. She was also a woman whose responsibility was inseparable from evident disorder of mind. That conjunction is uncomfortable, which is precisely why cases like hers endure in historical memory. They resist moral neatness. They do not allow the satisfactions of simple condemnation or easy absolution. Instead, they leave behind an atmosphere of unresolved gravity. Elizabeth Bastable's death stands at the center of that gravity. If Blanche's life after the crime demonstrates what Victorian England did with women judged dangerous and mad, Elizabeth's death demonstrates the cost of failing to prevent such danger within the home. She was the one whose ordinary life ended violently in the domestic sphere she had likely sustained through years of labor. She was the one who does not live on to be classified, interpreted, or institutionally managed. Her story narrows abruptly at the point Blanche's widens into public significance. This imbalance is one of the reasons she must be recalled deliberately at the close. Without Elizabeth, the case risks becoming only a study of the daughter's decline. With Elizabeth at the center, it remains what it truly was: a destruction of maternal life within the home itself. That destruction also altered the moral shape of everyone else's future. The Bastable household could not return to what it had been. A mother was gone. A daughter had become her killer. Even where names and details faded, the family structure had been permanently rewritten. The village, too, would have lived on with altered knowledge. Small communities, do not easily forget crimes that occur within known houses and known kinships. The memory may become quieter, but it remains embedded in local consciousness. Such crimes do not only enter records, they enter place. The landscape itself begins to carry them in a muted form. A lane, a parish, a district once associated with routine becomes linked, however discreetly, to a story of rupture. This is part of why old true crime cases continue to exert their pull. They suggest that the past is not sealed. Not because spirits linger, nor because melodrama survives untouched, but because human structures remain recognizable across time. The names change, the diagnoses change, the institutions change. Yet the underlying tensions, between family duty and private breakdown, between care and fear, between the desire to manage suffering and the reality of danger, remain painfully familiar. Blanche Bastable's story belongs firmly to Victorian England, but it does not feel remote in the way some historical crimes do. It feels near, precisely because the domestic questions it raises have never ceased to matter. How does a family recognize when distress has become peril? How long do people explain away what frightens them because they cannot bear the implications of naming it honestly? What happens to women whose suffering appears and forms their culture finds especially difficult to forgive? What does a society do when the household, which it has imagined as the first defense against disorder, becomes the place where disorder proves fatal? These questions are larger than one case, but the Bastable tragedy gives them a form no abstraction could provide. There is also something revealing in the quietness with which Blanche's story ends. No grand public afterlife attaches to her. No notorious legend elevates her into the pantheon of infamous Victorian murderesses. Instead, there is the house, the crime, the legal disposal, Broadmoor, decline, death. The line of the story grows narrower as it proceeds. This narrowing is important because it denies the false glamour that often gathers around true crime. Blanche did not become larger through violence. She became smaller in worldly terms. Her life contracted under the weight of what she had done and what had happened to her. The institution swallowed her public future. Death ended the rest. Such an ending should caution against reading her story as anything other than ruin. And ruin, properly understood, leaves little room for triumph. It leaves only the responsibility to look carefully at the structures that formed the lives of women like Blanche and Elizabeth. To look carefully at how domestic labor disappears from record until violence makes absence visible. To look carefully at the language of madness, which may illuminate suffering while also concealing the fears of those who apply it. To look carefully at the relationship between family love and family vulnerability. To look carefully at the institution, which may be both necessary within its own logic and devastating in its consequences. These are not lessons that simplify the past. They make it more difficult, which is another way of making it more truthful. If there is any final meaning to Blanche Bastable's case, it may lie there. Not in the satisfaction of a solved mystery, because the deepest parts of the case are not solvable in that sense. Not in the comfort of a moral parable, because the story refuses to behave as a neat warning. And not in the certainty that the past can now be fully understood, because too much of the intimate human texture has been lost. Rather, the case matters because it forces a confrontation with the limits of explanation itself. It asks how much can ever be known about the movement from suffering to violence within a family. It asks what gets preserved when women enter history through breakdown. It asks whose labor and whose pain are remembered, and whose are left behind in silence. Silence, in the end, is where the story returns. Not the silence of ignorance exactly, though there is much that cannot now be known. Nor the silence of innocence, because this was not an innocent story. It is the silence left after institutions, courts, villagers, and later readers have all said what they can. The silence of the house after the violence. The silence of the records once their categories are exhausted. The silence around Elizabeth's unrecorded years of work. The silence inside Broadmoor after notoriety has faded into routine. The silence of an early grave. The silence that remains when no further explanation can restore what was lost. It is tempting to think of silence as emptiness. Here, it is not empty. It is crowded with the things history only partly holds. A mother's routine, a daughter's unraveling, the strain of a household trying to endure what it cannot control, the shock of gunfire in a rural home, the cold, ordering language of the law, the institutional quiet that follows confinement, the smallness of an ending that does not resolve anything, only stops. This is what remains of Blanche Bastable's story. Not only a crime, not only a madwoman, not only a mother slain, but a record of how a society responded when the domestic world it trusted most deeply failed to contain one of its own tragedies. And in that failure, there is something larger than notoriety. There is the dark, enduring truth that behind even the most ordinary door, history has often been made not by public spectacle, but by private collapse. The fields remain, the village remains, the records remain, and beneath them all, so does the silence.